Lord of the Mystery, Lucky by author Nan Haiyu Xing Chen. Chapter 301-325. Chapter 301 Chapter 175 Synthesis of Great Amen. There's such a secret? Yordson asked in surprise. How come I've never heard of it? He glanced at Alice in astonishment, then looked around, his gaze finally resting on Brewall's monocle. It's true, Alice said seriously, taking out her own monocle and handing it over. Do you want to try wearing it? Yordson curiously reached out to take the monocle from Alice's hand. Okay, huh? His hand suddenly stopped, suspended in midair, and it was a long time before he stiffly uttered the last syllable. Yordson looked at Alice, who was still bewildered and hesitant, and it took several deep breaths before his normal speech returned. That monocle, is it a mystical item? A very dangerous one. After 2 seconds of blank staring, Alice silently withdrew her hand, looking at Yordson with a strange expression and saying, "No, it's not dangerous. On the contrary, it's practically useless. It enhances the ability to steal, and while wearing it, the wearer cannot taste food. I don't think it fits anyone's definition of dangerous." Yordson frowned in confusion. "However, I probably know why you think it's dangerous." Alice scanned Yordson and Brewall's, then stroked her chin and replied, "The owner of this monocle is also a marauder." She looked at Yordson's thoughtful expression, then suddenly adjusted her own expression to appear full of piety and solemnity. She placed her right hand over her left chest and, in an operatic tone, declared, "He is the king of marauders, the embodiment of deceit and mischief, the angel of time born in ancient times." He. Hearing that pronoun from Alice's mouth for the second time, Brewall's and Yordson, who were at the center of the incident, suddenly had a glimmer of understanding. Yordson's face turned pale. "He's a marauder angel. Ordinary angels can't defeat Amen. At least I can't." Alice's gaze flickered, then she looked at Brewall's and Yordson again, and then at Dunnits, stroking her chin and saying, "You have a first mate who likes to wear a monocle on this ship, a third mate who's a marauder, and a provoker as a crew member. Does this count as splitting Amen into 3 parts? After all, together you are the complete Amen. Ah, it sounds like I'm playing a game called to synthesize the great Amen. It would be even more fitting if all 3 of you were Amon's avatars." No one appreciated Alice's joke. Even without understanding the parasitic abilities of the Marauder high sequence and Amon's personality, Yordson quickly connected the dots from Alice's words. A high sequence of the same pathway would affect a low sequence. By wearing a monocle identical to one worn by an angel of that pathway, he would easily become an avatar of that angel. And this angel's avatar has the power of a demigod. Yordson had to admit, if viewed through this logic, Alice really hadn't told a single lie. At most, she just hadn't told the whole truth. This way of speaking, concealing part of the truth and downplaying the serious aspects. Yordson frowned and suddenly asked curiously, "Have you ever considered becoming a swindler?" Alice recalled how Amen invited her to be his dependents and the tone Amen used when saying, "I really like you," and she shivered in terror. She righteously rejected the suggestion. "Don't even mention that my pathway was destined from the start. Even if it wasn't, I would rather die, jump off the ship, than become a swindler. Otherwise, given his interest in me, I would either become a demigod, or become a demigod." Alice said, "Either become a demigod," twice, but Yordson felt he understood Alice's words. One was a true demigod, and the other was an angel's demigod avatar. Comparatively, the fact that her pathway was destined from the start didn't garner any attention. While being a natural half-Beander was uncommon, as well-informed pirates, coupled with Edwina who often taught them, they were not unfamiliar with such situations. They naturally assumed Alice was in this situation. Alice glanced at Yordson, sighed, and continued. "However, in this regard, you can't compare to our great angel of time. After all, his praise for me was that I am very suitable to be a provoker." Yordson looked at Alice, beginning to ponder what she had done to earn such praise from an angel. The most important thing was that she was still alive. Dunnits, who had never received such praise, was stunned for a few seconds, suddenly feeling that being angered to death by Alice was what he deserved. After all, he could truly imagine why Alice would receive such a level of praise. Although theoretically, she might have helped provoke others, like angering enemies to death, based on his understanding of Alice from their 2 meetings, Dunnits had no doubt, she definitely almost angered that angel to death. Wait, an angel's enemy couldn't be an ordinary person, right? Oh, right, she said she killed a demigod. Could it really have been by angering them to death? Dunitz fell into deep thought. Alice, unaware of Dunitz's plausible deductions, continued. I think, for the angel of time, who has existed since ancient times, this is definitely a double affirmation of my courage and wisdom. This must be the highest praise he could give. What a double affirmation of courage and wisdom. Jordson felt he understood everything and chose to keep quiet. He had initially felt it was a pity she wasn't a swindler, but now it seemed, a provoker was indeed more suitable for her. However, from the description, that angel seemed to have a very active personality. Thinking of this, Jordson instantly recalled Alice's remarks about scattered Amen and synthesized great Amen. He subtly glanced at Brewalls, moved a little further away from him, then, as if remembering something, looked at Dunitz, thought for a moment, and then gave up. Jordson believed that compared to Alice's naturally provocative methods, Dunitz, who only knew how to flip the middle finger and curse, dog shit, still had ample room for improvement. Alice watched regretfully as the three-part Amen gradually separated, completely losing the possibility of synthesizing the great Amen. She pouted regretfully, then suddenly leaned closer to Dunitz and asked curiously. You should actually be sequence 7, right? I remember it should be called Pyromaniac. It sounds like a sequence that causes trouble everywhere. Drawing Amen over should also count as causing trouble. End of this chapter. Chapter 302 Chapter 176 The Legend of Examination-Oriented Education. Before Dunitz could say anything, the door to the captain's cabin suddenly opened again, and Edwina's figure appeared in the doorway, calling out to Alice. Alice, come here for a moment. It was like a homeroom teacher suddenly appearing to call away a student who had made a mistake. Alice, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu, glanced guiltily at Dunitz and silently followed Edwina. The air in the captain's cabin was filled with the lingering scent of hydrosol and essential oils, and Alice realized that a ritual had taken place here not long ago. Unfortunately, the ritual site had already been tidied up, so Alice couldn't deduce the specific content of the ritual from what she saw. No, even if I had seen it, I might not have been able to deduce the content of the ritual, Alice thought, looking at Edwina with a puzzled expression. Why does her gaze seem a little gentler than before, and her expression too? Alice blinked twice blankly, and before she could speak, she heard Edwina ask in a soft voice. I remember you came from Lowen. Alice looked at her warily before saying, yes. Have you ever thought about visiting Lindbergh? Edwina asked. Alice paused, and for a moment, she thought of Amen, who had invited her to visit the forsaken land of the gods. Edwina seemed to misunderstand her silence and began to introduce her to the place. If you want to learn more about occult knowledge, Lindbergh is undoubtedly the best choice. There, you'll find. Stop, Alice interrupted her, raising a hand. Am I being trafficked again? Edwina was momentarily stunned, and before she could speak, she saw Alice's face turn cold as she said. No matter who told you to say this to me, I hate it when others interfere with my decisions. After a pause, she couldn't help but retort. How do I feel like you're even worse at keeping secrets than I am, Lindbergh, God of knowledge and wisdom, are you from the Church of Knowledge? Are all the people on your side only good at taking tests? Could it be that exam-oriented education has also been brought over? No, that's not right, that should be, is there someone else? Alice began to seriously consider how many transmigrators there were in this world. She glanced at Edwina, then with difficulty pressed her tongue against her tooth roots and rotated it, forcing back the retort she was about to utter. There are a bit too many transmigrators, aren't there? The protagonists of the era can't all be transmigration stories, there should also be rebirth stories, system stories, and various other genres. Really, if that's not enough, you could have a Dragon King returns, or a god of combat returns to find his child living in a dog kennel. If the male side is all covered, there could also be something like true and false young ladies, contract marriages, marriage before love, substitute lovers, that one already exists. Really, if that's not enough, we could have a Mary Sue Princess's Revenge Diary. No, wait, can't I just do that myself? Alice began to seriously consider whether human children could be born with rainbow hair and rainbow eyes. It might be difficult for them to float rose petals when they're young or cry pearls, and multicolored hair might be hard to manage, but heterochromia could reluctantly serve for the eyes. The appearance hurdle is passed. Money is the easiest to solve. Gangs and such, I feel like I can't act that part. Anyway, we'll see then. There are no computers or anything in this era. So does that solve the problem? Edwina frowned, looking at Alice, whose thoughts had traversed the Sonia Sea, crossed the raging sea, and headed straight for the mist sea, and fell into deep thought. At least take a detour. No, at least explain yourself clearly. There was too much ambiguity in Alice's words, and aside from the parts she blurted out but didn't explain clearly, those keywords that were turned into ellipses obviously left Edwina utterly perplexed. But Alice clearly had no intention of explaining to her. She nodded thoughtfully, then looked up to find Edwina still watching her. After a pause, she hesitantly asked, "Do you have any other questions?" Now it's, you, again, formal. The change in pronouns made Edwina keenly aware of Alice's shift in attitude. She suddenly felt she had found a trick to discern Alice's emotions and tried asking, "I imagine you don't intend to stay here and systematically study occult knowledge. You actually teach systematically here?" Alice's eyes widened in surprise. Edwina thought for a moment and said, "Not entirely, but it's basically from shallow to deep." Alice took a small breath, looked at her with an admiring gaze, then curiously asked, "Do you have textbooks?" Edwina hesitantly shook her head. Alice's eyes darted around, and she showed a not-so-friendly smile as she said, "I have a suggestion, do you want to hear it?" Edwina nodded hesitantly. Alice cleared her throat twice and said, "First, prepare a set of uniform clothing for the students. This clothing should be loose, coarse, ugly in style, and either dark or bizarre in color. For example, what I'm wearing now falls into the dark color category. Secondly, set a uniform and regular timetable for the students. For example, morning reading starts at 7, ends at 7:30, half an hour for exercise or ideological education. Classes start at 8, lunch at 12, ends at 12:30. Classes resume at 2 in the afternoon, dinner at 6, ends at 6:30, evening self-study starts at 7 and continues until 11, and they must be asleep by 11:30. Of course, people cannot be fatigued like this all the time, or they will definitely go mad. For the sake of the students' mental health, we can tell them they get a 2-day break every 2 weeks, and then cancel the holidays with various excuses. For example, we can hold weekly tests, monthly tests, rank each test, review the papers, analyze the overall class ranking, encourage students who have improved, criticize those who have fallen, and at the same time, have the top-ranked students share their study experience. Another example is, we can use the excuse of having a 3-day holiday next week to cancel this week's holiday, and we can also use holiday time to hold various activities to occupy their breaks. At the same time, we can assign a large amount of homework for the holidays. Of course, we should assign it normally too, but the amount assigned for holidays must be extremely large, so that students deeply realize that holidays are worse than school. Open black lens bracket note 1 close black lens bracket. Alice spoke eloquently, and Edwina grew more silent and her expression more complex the more she listened. It wasn't until Alice finally stopped that she gave her assessment with a complicated mood. "The system you described might be very suitable for a prisoner. How can you treat a prisoner like that?" Alice's eyes widened. "A prisoner has human rights too." End of chapter. Chapter 303 Chapter 177 Persuasion. This time, Edwina fell into a longer silence. Several minutes later, she finally spoke. "That grade 0 sealed artifact you mentioned, what specific sequence is it? Where did it come from?" Alice swallowed, cautiously saying, "Perhaps. Sequence 1. That sealed artifact came from the Life School of Thought. You should know the Life School of Thought, right?" Life School of Thought. Edwina nodded, her expression unchanged as she asked, "Which pathway?" This was an easy question to answer. Alice breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Monster, or fate." After giving this answer, Alice noticed that Edwina's attitude suddenly relaxed. Noticing her puzzled gaze, Edwina thought for a moment, then confirmed with her. "What sequence were you at the time?" Alice fell silent for a moment, her gaze drifting as she said, "Let's just say it was sequence 5. A second time. Edwina frowned, recalling Alice's phrase, "this body," and suddenly had a strange guess. This isn't her original body. Alice felt Edwina's gaze towards her suddenly hold a hidden intensity. She cautiously took half a step back, crossing her arms over her chest, and stared at Edwina without speaking. Edwina looked at Alice's actions, realized the current situation, calmed down, and continued the previous topic. Directly consuming a potion to advance beyond your sequence is an extremely dangerous act. From sequence 5 onwards, a Beyander's advancement requires ritual assistance. Taking a high sequence potion without a ritual is no different from seeking death. And the danger of directly devouring a Beyander characteristic is far greater than consuming a well-prepared potion. I assume you know what a Beyander characteristic is. Alice nodded. Edwina then continued. Under normal circumstances, the only possible outcome for your situation would be losing control. But the fate pathway, from what I understand, the fate pathway has its own unique characteristics. Alice's mouth twitched, interrupting Edwina, who was still organizing her words. Quote, I think you don't need to say any more. I understand what you mean. Isn't it just a gambler's pathway, haha. Alice lowered her eyes, a dark light flashing within them. Compared to Beyonders of other pathways, who at least appear free, Beyonders of the fate pathways seem to live their entire lives under the arrangement of fate. It seems that for Beyonders of the fate pathway, from sequence 5 to sequence 4, it's a huge turning point. But, if that's truly how one can control their own fate, why have I been pushed to where I am today? Alice suddenly lost interest in speaking. She looked up and asked Edwina, do you have anything else? She was getting a little impatient. Alice's change in tone was very obvious, and Edwina immediately gave up on continuing the conversation, telling her gently. Not for now, you can go out and explore. Alice turned to leave, then stopped halfway, turning back to Edwina and saying, goodbye. Edwina subconsciously nodded, then watched Alice turn and leave impatiently. She's quite polite. Edwina thought silently, while pulling out paper and pen to write a letter to Gehrman Sparrow. She was stuck on the first hurdle, the salutation. Dear Gehrman. No, I'm writing to discuss his concealment of true information. Such a salutation lacks deterrence. But simply writing his name is impolite. Perhaps I can use other adjectives. After much deliberation between politeness and deterrence, Edwina ultimately did not write anything like, damned Gehrman, or, respected student's parent, as Alice had, which were overtly or subtly insulting. Instead, she chose to omit the salutation. I have some questions about Alice Kingsley that I would like to ask you. She claims to have accidentally swallowed a grade 0 sealed artifact from the Life School of Thought, but from current observations, her condition is abnormally stable, far more stable than any angel who advanced through normal pathways that I have seen. I hope you can provide a detailed explanation of the specific situation. Additionally, the Golden Dream is not a specialized school, nor is it adept at safeguarding grade 0 sealed artifacts. If you have corresponding needs, you might consider taking her to Lindbergh to study in a church school, or to receive a sealing. Oh, have you heard of exam-oriented education? She introduced me to a very terrifying education system and called it exam-oriented education. This education system requires students to study for over 10 hours a day, with only 2 or 3 days off a month. Do you know where she learned about it? Please reply as soon as possible. When Klein received Edwina's letter, he was volunteering. Although Klein very much wanted to try the digestion effect that acting as Alice could provide, firstly, he didn't think he could constantly come up with sudden ideas like Alice, and secondly, he was indeed scared by that stand-in literature. He was very worried that if he did so, at the next tarot club, Miss Fate would present Mr. Fool with something strange like, the tyrannical angel of time's stand-in lover. Of course, this was considering the optimistic direction. Klein worried that one day he would see a bestseller called, This, or a best-selling comic. He found it hard to imagine such a scene. Of course, Klein had no time to worry about that now. After opening and reading Edwina's letter, he fell into contemplation. Was this a dissuasion? Klein read the letter from beginning to end again, then breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, it seemed Alice hadn't caused trouble. No, it was also possible that she hadn't had time to cause trouble, or had already caused it and it hadn't been discovered yet. Recalling the Saint Fuerin, Klein's thoughts on whether Alice had caused trouble became increasingly optimistic. She would cause trouble sooner or later, it was only a matter of time. Klein ignored Edwina's suggestion regarding Lindbergh and the Church of Knowledge, as even if Alice truly reached the point of needing to be sealed, it probably wouldn't be the Church of Knowledge's turn. He fell into contemplation regarding the exam-oriented education Edwina mentioned. Note 1. If he remembered correctly, wasn't Alice wearing a school uniform recently? As expected of you, Alice. Klein reached up and covered his face, and the image of Dunitz in a Chinese-style school uniform suddenly popped into his mind, his eyes gradually becoming hollow and lost. If she were sent to a church school in Lindbergh, such uniforms wouldn't become popular there, would they? Klein took a sharp breath, suddenly beginning to doubt whether his previous decision was correct. He kept feeling like Alice hadn't become obedient. Was it just an illusion? End of this chapter. Chapter 304 Chapter 178, Education Through Entertainment. Alice emerged from the captain's cabin. The pirates who had gathered around had dispersed. Her eyes darted around as she began searching for Amon's 3 components on the ship. Eamon, where are you? No, Jordson, Dunitz, Brewalls, where did you all go? A pirate ship, combining magic and technology, didn't require all crew members to be at their posts. Most of the time, only 1 or 2 people working was enough, so Alice quickly found Jordson, who was slacking off. He was literally fishing. When Alice approached, he was pulling an oversized children's fishing net out of the water, and inside, 3 large fish were still thrashing about. Want to give it a try? He turned his head, saw Alice, and extended an invitation. After Alice stared at him for 2 seconds, one of the 3 fish still flopping in the net suddenly leapt up, flicked its tail, splashing him with fishy seawater, and regained its freedom. Alice immediately clutched her stomach and burst out laughing. Jordson wiped the water from his face, looked at Alice thoughtfully, and asked curiously, "Did you do that?" "Don't talk nonsense," Alice said righteously. "Do you have any evidence?" Jordson, who had no evidence, fell silent. Alice quickly turned to leave the scene, intending to find the next interesting thing, but was suddenly called back. "Alice. You don't mind me calling you that, do you? I've always wanted to ask, where did the clothes you're wearing come from?" Alice tugged at her clothes, then looked up and said with a serious expression, "This is a memento of my beautiful youth." Jordson subtly reminded her, "You don't seem to be an adult yet." Alice looked at Jordson, hesitating to speak, and decided to use a more subtle approach. "The first line of my honorific name is, Forever Innocent Child." Honorific name. Jordson's expression became hesitant. Alice blinked, and said quickly, "Oh dear, I just remembered the captain called me for something. I'm off." She quickly turned and fled the scene, looking for her next target to bother. Besides Edwina, Alice only knew 3 people on this ship. She observed Brewalls' monocle from a distance and decided it would be better to go bother Dunitz. "So, that's why you came to find me." Dunitz listened to Alice's reasoning, dumbfounded, and his eyes became exceedingly angry. "Exactly," Alice said matter-of-factly, "give me something to do, or I'll find something for you to do." "What thing?" Dunitz asked subconsciously. Alice turned to Dunitz, flashed a mysterious smile, then turned and left amidst Dunitz's confused gaze. After Dunitz stood stunned for 2 seconds, a bad premonition suddenly rose in his heart. He hastily spoke to stop Alice from leaving. "Wait a minute. You." Ouch. His left foot tripped over his right, and he fell forward, his knees hitting the ground heavily, and his head also bumped against the floor, while he instinctively braced himself with his hands. Alice turned around at this moment, looking down at him from above, and said in a deep tone, "You may rise." Dunitz didn't understand the meaning of this sentence spoken in Chinese, but that didn't prevent him from realizing Alice's troublemaking ability once again and trying to get up from the ground. After getting halfway up and then sliding back down to his knees, Dunitz finally realized that if he didn't give Alice something to do, he might have to crawl there until Alice got bored of the game. "You can go find the captain," Dunitz suggested. "The captain has a collection room, which might have things you're interested in, and she should be very happy to tell you about her collection." Quote. Collection room. After hearing Alice's words, Edwina was startled. "Are you interested in these?" "No," Alice shook her head, "but I love listening to stories, different stories." Edwina nodded thoughtfully and said, "In that case, have you heard of the treasures of the Great Sea?" "I know." Alice raised her hand as if answering a teacher's question before saying, "The Key of Death, the Fountain of Youth, the legacy of the Solomon Empire, the Ghost Empire and the Lost Nuance, and also. Alice paused, then said with a face full of yearning, in my favorite, Sunken Laurel. Edwina recalled Gehrman Sparrow, who had once invited her to hunt the Blood Admiral. Truly, they were a family. Edwina accepted this premise with mixed feelings, nodded, and said, what do you think of these treasures? Alice was silent for a moment, then pursed her lips and said, if it were when I first woke up, I would want to go on an adventure at sea, to search for these treasures. If it were now, I would consider why they haven't been discovered for so long. It's like the sunken laurel. With beyonders around, searching and salvaging shouldn't be difficult, right? Just woke up. Edwina, who caught the keyword, remained composed. After looking at Alice, she said, in that case, follow me. Before this, you might have heard some news, for example, that I found the key of death. Is that true? Alice asked curiously. In fact, I believe that key belongs to the giant, Edwina said as she led Alice into the ship's cabin, heading to the second floor. Giant. Alice was slightly startled, remembering the sun far away in the city of silver. Yes, Edwina nodded, this is the conclusion I drew from combining historical documents and other items on the ship. Alice looked at her with sparkling eyes. Indeed, she was more suited to listening to stories with knowledge points rather than regular classes. Her decisions could easily change, but only if her interest was piqued and she actively changed her mind. Edwina nodded inwardly and continued. Those documents show that in the fourth epoch, many giants were still active. Some converted to the god of combat, while others were scattered across various regions, becoming targets for human hunting. One of these tribes built ships, attempting to go to sea to find the lost giant court, and never returned. The shipwreck we found and some of its contents are extremely similar to the ancient artifacts they left behind at their original settlement. Therefore, we have sufficient reason to believe that the key belongs to the giants, and it very likely points to their tribe's royal court that was lost before the Great Cataclysm. As she spoke, she stopped in front of a slightly ajar door, gently pushed it open, then turned to Alice and said, we've arrived. End of chapter. Chapter 305 Chapter 179 The Failed Writer Fantasy Dragon. Wow! Alice exclaimed, peeking into the collection room with a look of delighted surprise. How amazing! It's like this again. Edwina watched Alice's reaction and frowned once more. Too vivid, too lively, and too fake. Edwina glanced at Alice, thought for a moment, and then reminded her, you should at least start exclaiming after you've seen what's inside. That makes sense. Alice listened to Edwina's words, found them very reasonable, and peered inside. She then resumed her expression of astonishment. Edwina's collection room had several tables casually placed, with a few cabinets standing beside them. Both the cabinets and tables held numerous items, making the collection rich and diverse. Alice's gaze swept around the collection room and landed on a giant black iron key. The key was casually placed on a wooden table. Alice pointed at it and asked, is that the key of death? Yes, Edwina nodded slightly. Everything here is some of the spoils from our past treasure hunts. You can look around. Alice, as if given permission, quickly ran over and looked at the key of death. The key was over a meter long. Even without considering its weight, Alice felt it would be strange to just pick it up with her hand. After a brief thought, she recalled the posture for holding a zither in TV dramas and hugged the key. The key was iron black and dull all over. Alice silently memorized the patterns on it, then began to use methods a diviner would employ to investigate the key's origin. Relying on her keen spirituality intuition, Alice didn't focus on unimportant scenes, only on the most crucial frame. It was a twilight scene. In the solidified twilight, a magnificent cluster of buildings stood. Alice couldn't make out the details, but she could feel the ancient aura within the architecture. Alice made the images disappear from her sight, put the key back in its original place, and decided to ask the sun about it later. After a moment of thought, Alice turned her head and said in an ethereal voice, Twilight. Before Edwina could speak, Alice decisively retracted her gaze and began searching the table. Next to the key of death lay a book bound with parchment. The deep brown cover had a line of ancient Fosak script. Grossel's Travels. Grossel's Travels. Alice's eyes lit up. Is this the travelogue whose owners all went missing? Gehrman mentioned it to you. Edwina nodded. We found this travelogue in a sunken ship at the bottom of the sea. It had been submerged for 165 years and was still undamaged. Alice looked down at the book in her arms in surprise, recalling her outrageous statement about, "What's left after burning is the blasphemy card." She thought for a moment, then opened the book to a page, grabbed both halves, and tried to tear it. She failed. After 2 seconds of silence, Alice looked up at Edwina with an innocent expression and asked, "Do you know what this book is about?" Edwina didn't dwell on Alice's attempt to tear the book. She glanced at her and said, "Perhaps you would prefer to read it yourself. It's a novel. It's actually a travelogue-style novel." Alice blinked, lowered her head, and began to read. The protagonist of the book is a giant named Grossel. He decides to go to the Iceberg Kingdom to hunt the King of the North, a powerful dragon. Wait, why would he do such a thing? Alice confusedly flipped back and forth, realizing the author hadn't written it. Well, that's fine, I guess. Grossel met his first companion on his journey, a female elf named Shattaz. How did they suddenly become so familiar with each other? Alice was greatly shocked. Alice continued reading. Alice found that this was not an isolated incident. Grossel met many companions along the way: the female elf Shattaz, the devout ascetic snowman, the Solomon Empire noble Mobert Zoroaster, and the Loan soldier Longzil. The book did not describe how the protagonist group became familiar, they just abruptly met and then became familiar, deciding to go together to defeat the King of the North. Alice repeatedly thought she had missed something and went back to reread. The story abruptly ended after the protagonist group encountered the King of the North. Alice stared at the last few glued together pages and fell into contemplation. A hiatus dog. She ground her teeth, looked up at Edwina, who explained. It was like this when we got it. The last few pages of this book are impossible to open, no matter what method is used. Look on the bright side, Alice cursed maliciously, maybe the author starved to death before finishing it. Edwina felt she fully understood Alice's resentment, and she advised. Perhaps you can try to find a way to open it, since you are still on the ship. Alice angrily slammed the book shut, completely forgetting her previous speculation that the book's former owners might have all transmigrated into the book. She gritted her teeth and cursed. There's no logic at all in the writing. What a trash book. The author definitely starved to death. Edwina closed her mouth. Alice threw Grossel's travels back onto the table and continued searching the room. This is a gold coin from the Fourth Epic Solomon Empire, Edwina proactively introduced when she noticed Alice's gaze land on a gold coin in a picture frame. A commemorative coin issued by the Solomon Empire. Alice automatically translated Edwina's words into language she understood and leaned in to observe it closely. It was dark gold overall, appearing to be made of two semicircles of unequal size joined together, extremely asymmetrical, and its surface was engraved with a pointed crown. Quite pretty. Alice's eyes sparkled as she looked at Edwina. After 2 seconds of eye contact, Edwina proactively suggested, "If the price is right, I might consider selling it to you." Alice silently withdrew her gaze. She doesn't want to spend money. But she's actually quite well behaved. That's normal, after all, it's the fate pathway. Edwina glanced at Alice thoughtfully and continued. All the items in this collection room are like this, including the key of death and Grossel's travels from just now. Alice began to consider the possibility of robbing the Lord of Storms' church again. Or incite Aemon to rob. No, then it wouldn't have anything to do with me, would it? Taking money from the King of Angels of the Marauder pathway. Aha. Alice was lost in thought, glancing around the room, when suddenly, her spirituality stirred. She instinctively looked in the direction of the spiritual sensation. End of chapter. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Chapter 306 Chapter 180 The Legend of Cassandra. Alice walked over and pulled a thin notebook from the cabinet. Unlike the Grossel's travels, which clearly wasn't simple, this seemed to be just an ordinary book. Oh, wait, the stories inside were handwritten. Alice turned to look at Edwina. I collected this at a secret gathering not long ago, Edwina said, walking over. It contains a very interesting story, but it should be fictional, after all. She paused, didn't give a reason, but smiled and said to Alice, "You should be interested, because the protagonist of the story is a soothsayer." Soothsayer. Alice was slightly startled and curiously opened the content. King Priam of Troy and Queen Hecuba's third daughter, Cassandra, was their most beautiful daughter. She was as beautiful as golden Aphrodite and was a priestess of Apollo. Ah! The first familiar name was a hallucination, the second familiar name was a coincidence, the third, the fourth, the fifth. Well, it wasn't that exaggerated, but with Cassandra, Aphrodite, and Apollo appearing together, Alice no longer held any hope. This was clearly Greek mythology. No, actually, it couldn't be certain, it might be Roman mythology, haha. Alice read the entire story with a subway old man looking at his phone expression. In the story, Cassandra was a princess of Troy, granted the ability of prophecy by Apollo, and later cursed for refusing to be with Apollo, becoming a soothsayer whose prophecies were never believed. What followed was Cassandra's tragic life, and in the end, she died because her prophecies were not believed. Alice patiently read the entire story. Although she didn't remember many of the details clearly, the familiar names and similar content allowed Alice to be certain that this was Greek or Roman mythology copied by who knows who. Emperor Rosal. Undeniably, this was indeed the most obvious answer, but Alice immediately ruled out this possibility. How could Rosal silently copy the story? He should be proclaiming everywhere that he wrote it. However, Alice did understand why Edwina thought it was fictional. After all the divine names on it were unheard of. Even civilizations as isolated as the City of Silver had gods whose beliefs left traces in history. For such completely unheard of names, the possibility of being fictional was, of course, higher than the possibility of a hidden civilization existing. Alice closed the notebook without a word and solemnly asked, "Could you tell me more about the person who gave you this story?" She knew about that story. Edwina's eyes brightened slightly. She said to Alice, "That person concealed his appearance. Why don't you try divination? I still have to ask if you know." Alice said, while trying to divine the origin of this story. Yes, the origin of the story, who copied this story, and how many hands it passed through wasn't important. What was important was the person who first wrote the story. But Alice quickly realized that the result would disappoint her. The origin of this story was obscured by an unknown force. Alice withdrew from a gray-white illusion, realizing that she, as she was now, did not yet have the ability to see the truth. Alice frowned fiercely. She was essentially a living uniqueness of the fate pathway, and she also had a portion of the power belonging to the Sephira, key of light, wrapped around her. Theoretically, in matters involving fate, her authority was very high. If she wasn't afraid of death, she could even peek at an outer deity. As for a pillar, she hadn't tried a pillar yet. Theoretically, within the scope of her knowledge, the only one who could block her anti-divination was herself. Alice fell into deep thought. "Have you heard this story before?" Edwina's voice pulled Alice's thoughts back. "You seem very concerned." Alice was silent for a moment, then, after putting the notebook back in its place, she said with downcast eyes, "It shouldn't exist here, just like this dress on me. They both do not belong to existing civilizations." Does not belong to existing civilizations. Edwina's eyes grew even brighter. "Could you elaborate?" Alice's movements paused slightly. She looked up at her, and after a moment of thought, said, "I come from before the first epoch. I awoke in the second epoch, then fell into slumber, only to awaken again recently." She met Edwina's gaze calmly, clearly seeing the alternating emotions of shock and joy, as well as the fear overshadowed by joy, flashing in Edwina's eyes. "Would you mind staying on the ship for a while longer?" she suddenly suggested. "We are different from ordinary pirate ships. In nature, we are closer to treasure hunters. Our main activities involve searching for various treasures on the high seas." Alice fell into deep thought. Looking at Edwina, who was trying hard to recruit her, Alice closed her eyes and asked, "Do people of your Church of Knowledge value knowledge over life?" She completely didn't consider why I could live so long. She only cared about the civilization before the first epoch. Oh no, maybe she also cared about the second epoch history I remembered. Edwina's excitement and joy contrasted sharply with the fear and awe Audrey and Alger showed when they first heard this news in Alice's memory. For a moment, Alice remembered Klein, who was the first to care about her. Could people really be so different from each other? A faint trace of confusion flashed in Alice's eyes. She suddenly remembered Winifred Grigori, who had given her a strangely inexplicable feeling during their 2 meetings, and a subtle feeling arose. Strange, inexplicable, unconventional. Why couldn't she be human? That is to say, with so many people in this world, if someone's personality is more like a human, it's also normal, right? Why am I still using that word to describe myself? Alice silently cursed Eamon fiercely in her heart, and then said to Edwina. I won't tell you, unless you convert to me. No, never mind. It's too strange for a follower to lecture their deity. Don't do that, please don't do that, I won't tell you. Alice clearly saw that Edwina had a moment of being tempted, and after hearing the latter half of her sentence, she showed even more regret. Are all the followers of the Church of Knowledge fair weather friends? Alice silently sympathized with the God of knowledge and wisdom for 1 second. End of this chapter. Chapter 307, Chapter 181,123, Wooden Man. It's almost time. Edwina quickly put away her regretful expression. Although you probably don't need to eat, would you like to try the ship's dinner? No, I need to, Alice said with a serious face. Children need to eat on time and sleep on time, otherwise they won't grow tall. Okay. Edwina's expression gradually lost its initial calmness, becoming increasingly complex. She led Alice out of the collection room and towards the dining room. Midway, as if remembering something, she asked, why don't you suspect that Grossel's Travels was written by Rosal? Huh. Alice showed a bewildered expression. Gehrman asked that, Edwina explained. Alice looked up at the ceiling, which was designed to look like a sky, then explained. There are 2 main reasons. First, if this thing was written by Rosal, he would definitely be shouting about it everywhere, wishing the whole world knew he wrote it. Second, this book is written too badly. It was clearly not a masterpiece, and even as a web novel, it was too bad. It couldn't have been written by the great emperor in his previous life, could it? He didn't starve to death because he couldn't make a living writing novels, did he? Alice lowered her head and began to ponder. Edwina glanced at her and asked curiously, why do you sound like you know Emperor Rosal so well? Do you admire him greatly? Why would you think that? Alice looked up, puzzled. You said the book was written too badly, so it doesn't seem like he wrote it, Edwina said, looking at her. Alice opened her mouth, seemingly wanting to say something, but she ultimately swallowed her words, nodding instead with a serious expression. Yes, I greatly admire Emperor Rosal. He has done many things I cannot even imagine. He truly astounds me. After all, a normal person couldn't write a diary series like The Taste of a Witch is really good. Alice suppressed the urge to curl her lips, preventing her true thoughts from being revealed through a smile. She had completely ignored the fact that, aside from the groundbreaking first volume, the subsequent entries of the so-called diary series were actually her own continuations. Edwina looked at Alice's serious expression and realized she was lying. No, it couldn't be considered a lie, or rather, she didn't think she was lying, otherwise she would nervously start glancing around. With such a righteous attitude, she must at least believe what she was saying was true. She didn't tell the whole truth. That is to say, she should indeed greatly admire Rosal, because Rosal did some things that ordinary people wouldn't do or couldn't do. Were they those inventions and creations? No, that's not right. If that were the case, her attitude wouldn't be so strange. Speaking of which, she said she came from before the first epoch. At that time, was there civilization? At that time, there weren't even humans. Edwina frowned. Although still unable to understand, Edwina didn't forget the main task. She led Alice into the dining room, to the one reserved for the captain. The special food here is yogurt, which can be topped with strawberry or other jams, or directly with honey, Edwina said, pointing to the row of food outside the door. There are also several good types of dried fish, from the deep sea, of unnamed species. As she spoke, she walked outside the door, demonstrating to Alice through her actions. Alice then followed Edwina, taking whatever Edwina took, and as much as Edwina took. After several repetitions, Edwina finally couldn't take it anymore and turned around to suggest, you can choose according to your own taste. Alice nodded as if enlightened. Edwina then turned back with relief to continue getting food, only to find that Alice's actions hadn't changed at all. She turned back with a complex expression, meeting Alice's innocent big eyes. She didn't speak, so Alice also didn't speak, quietly watching her, blinking occasionally. The other pirates also tacitly avoided the two of them, leaving them to stare at each other. 2 minutes later, Edwina asked, unable to bear it any longer, "What exactly are you doing?" Her voice conveyed a sense of genuine exhaustion, but Alice's subsequent words clearly left her even more speechless. "We are all wooden people, cannot speak, cannot laugh, cannot move, cannot jump, let's see who does the best." This was clearly a children's game rhyme. Even without having played similar games, Edwina understood the rules. She opened her mouth, then gave up on reasoning with Alice, and instead asked, "Then why do you imitate my actions?" Alice tilted her head and explained, "At first, it was because you were demonstrating, so I followed you. Later, you seemed to mind me imitating your actions, so I continued to follow you. Normally, if you found I minded, shouldn't you stop doing it?" Edwina tried to reason with Alice. "But it's more fun to keep doing it," Alice said with a serious face. Edwina was speechless. Edwina turned her head and continued to get food. Debating with a child who only thinks about fun is meaningless, you just need to tell her whether she can or cannot. But even realizing this, Edwina also understood that she couldn't take the next step, making Alice genuinely agree that this thing couldn't be done. After all, first, she couldn't beat Alice and couldn't make her scared. Second, she couldn't threaten Alice with things she cared about. Edwina, who had previously taught mostly adult students, realized for the first time how difficult it was to raise a child, especially when that child was an angel. She felt she would never forget Gehrman Sparrow in her life. Edwina's not-so-intense reaction made Alice lose interest in continuing to imitate. She silently retreated a few steps back to her original position and added some more food. "Can I take a bit of everything and try it all?" "No, never mind, that's not very good. I can stay here for a while longer, that way I can eat more." Without Edwina knowing, she successfully achieved her goal, making Alice stay on the ship a bit longer, so she could freeload knowledge, so she could gather information. After all, it was already a fact that the secret organization behind Gehrman Sparrow had a level 0 sealed artifact that could run, jump, eat, drink, and talk. Before long, Alice had finished getting her food. Edwina had already returned before her, sitting at the table and eating. Alice thought for a moment, then unceremoniously carried her tray and sat opposite Edwina, beginning to gnaw on dried fish with her jam-topped yogurt. End of this chapter. Chapter 308 Chapter 182 The Taste of Knowledge. After biting into a piece of dried fish, made from an unnamed deep-sea fish, Alice felt that its only drawback was its deep-sea origin. It's not easy to catch. She licked her lips and tentatively asked Edwina, "Normally, the right to name something belongs to the first person who discovers it. Did the discoverer of this fish not name it?" "No," Edwina shook her head, seemingly unconcerned about the name of the fish she was eating. Alice lowered her head to examine the fish in her hand. Her knowledge couldn't help her identify the species of fish, it only told her that the fish had delicate flesh and a delicious taste, astonishingly good with every bite. "Oh, she tasted that." Alice licked her lips and asked Edwina, "Do you think I could name this fish?" Edwina looked up at Alice, evidently curious about what unique name Alice would come up with. This was tacit approval. Alice looked down at the dried fish in her hand, then looked up and analyzed seriously. "Look, it comes from the deep sea, and it tastes delicious. How about we call it Deep Sea Delicious Fish?" Note 1. Edwina's eyes became vacant. "Is my name not good?" Alice asked earnestly. Edwina was silent for more than 10 seconds before replying in a tone devoid of emotion, a very creative name." Alice's eyes immediately curved into a smile. She mumbled as she ate, "I told you, I'm really good at naming things." Edwina offered no comment. After dinner was not bedtime. Alice followed Edwina out of the dining hall, asking curiously, "Generally speaking, what do you all do after dinner?" "It depends," Edwina said as she led her out of the cabin. "Generally, I'll be in the collection room or reading." Alice looked at her in surprise. "Are you surprised?" Edwina retorted. Alice looked up at the sea, not yet swallowed by darkness. "Normally, even if you don't participate in games, like cards, gambling, or drinking, you should at least take a walk on the deck and enjoy the scenery, right?" Edwina was silent for a couple of seconds, then asked, "What do you think is the most common scenery we see?" "Ah." Alice hesitated, "The sea." "Exactly," Edwina nodded, "and unfortunately, all parts of the sea are the same." "No," Alice couldn't help but correct her, "the sea is different when there's a shipwreck." Edwina looked at Alice with an extremely complex expression. Alice was silent for 2 seconds, instinctively looking up to study the star in the sky, then suddenly remembered the mother tree of desire, and she quietly lowered her head to study the patterns on the deck. Edwina rationally decided not to argue with her, resolving to write a letter to Gehrman Sparrow about all these matters later. As is well known, both family education and school education are important. Edwina began to change the subject. Typically, at this time, others would be in their rooms reviewing the knowledge they learned in the morning. However, tomorrow night will be an exception. I think you might be interested in a bonfire party. It's also our way of expressing welcome. Alice's eyes indeed lit up. So Edwina knew the answer. She led Alice into the room prepared for her and said, "This is your room. If you want to read, I have books I can lend you. You won't damage the books, right?" "If I damage them, I'll fix them," Alice said confidently. How will you fix them?" Edwina remembered Alice's decisive tearing of Grossel's travels the moment she got it, and couldn't help but ask. Alice thought for a moment, raised her left hand, grabbed her left sleeve with her right hand, and pulled hard. With a tearing sound, the sleeve was ripped into 2 pieces. Then, Alice lowered her right hand, and under the effect of restart, the sleeve reassembled itself back to its original position, with not a single wrinkle out of place. Edwina's eyes brightened even more. She looked at Alice, her words turning over in her throat several times before she finally spoke. "What sequence is this ability?" "Sequence 1, Alice explained. Edwina's eyes darkened again, her enthusiasm quelled. Alice hesitated and asked, "Do you have books that need to be repaired?" "No," Edwina shook her head, "you should have heard that I can simulate abilities of Xing." "Ah," Alice suddenly understood, "I can't help with that. Should I demonstrate it a few more times for you?" She blinked, meeting Edwina's gaze, and Edwina realized that she was genuinely trying to help. She really is just a child. Edwina shook her head with a slight smile, declining the offer. "No need. Instead of doing that, you should consider listening to the lessons properly and helping me digest the potion." Alice's eyes widened in surprise, there's even a sequence for being a teacher. Since she wasn't asking about her specific abilities, and it wasn't difficult for Alice to guess her pathway, Edwina answered generously. "Sequence 5 of the Reader pathway, called Mysticism Magister." "Reader," Alice repeated thoughtfully, "no wonder you like to read. Do you need any?" Edwina asked. "No." "Oh, wait," Alice first shook her head firmly, then thought for a moment and asked, "Do you have fairy tales and novels?" "Yes," Edwina nodded. "In fact, if I didn't, I wouldn't have suggested she read. After all, she doesn't look like someone who can sit quietly and read textbooks." Edwina sighed inwardly, looked up at the bright-eyed Alice, and understood her meaning. So a few minutes later, Alice fell into contemplation, looking at the thick stack of books Edwina brought over. "Come ask me for more when you've finished these," Edwina smiled gently and left the room. Alice looked at the stack of books, measured it with her hand, and found that it piled from her waist all the way up to her chest. She closed her eyes in distress, threw herself onto the bed, and after more than 10 seconds, she opened her eyes, looked at the ceiling, and murmured, "If only I could learn the knowledge inside by eating the books." That wouldn't work either, books would definitely taste awful. "No, not necessarily." Alice slowly sat up, looked at the thick stack of books with slight hesitation, and slowly licked her lips. End of chapter. Chapter 309. Chapter 183. Taste. Flavor. When Klein finished reading A Letter to Parents, and came to talk to Alice, Alice was holding a book titled The Life and Lies of Rosal Gustav, and hesitating where to start. "I didn't cause any trouble." Above the gray fog, Alice slammed the table, emphasizing this after learning of Klein's intentions. "I know," Klein said, pinching his brow. Edwina had told him exactly how Alice had behaved that day, and honestly, in terms of severity, it wasn't as bad as what he'd experienced when he was impersonating Admiral Emlyn. She had clearly reined herself in a lot. He just wasn't sure if it was temporary or if she could maintain it. Thinking this, Klein glanced at Alice and encouraged her, "You're doing great, keep it up." He didn't even expect Alice to improve. Although she didn't catch the underlying meaning in Klein's words, Alice instinctively frowned at the statement, "Why do I always feel like you're trying to coax a child?" "Aren't you?" Klein asked, somewhat puzzled. Alice fell into contemplation. If it were Edwina speaking, she would definitely emphasize that she had lived for thousands of years, but if Klein had existed since before the first epoch until today, he really should be much older than her. She stared at Klein, thinking seriously for more than 10 seconds, then suddenly realized. "You old geezer." Quote. Klein glared at her. Alice blinked innocently twice and quickly ran away. While entering Saphira Castle required permission, escaping did not. Back in the real world, the first thing Alice saw was the book, The Life and Lies of Rosal Gustav. She immediately remembered her previous plan, picked up the book, thought for a moment, then opened her mouth towards the corner of the book. Alice was woken by a knock at the door. She groggily pushed open the door and saw Edwina outside. "Morn," she mumbled a greeting, then collapsed bonelessly onto Edwina. Edwina instinctively reached out to support her, and despite realizing how unrealistic the question was, she couldn't help but ask hesitantly, "You didn't sleep well?" "No," Alice shook her head, "I just didn't want to get up." As she spoke, she shook her head twice vigorously, her eyes quickly clearing, then she stood up straight and said seriously. "As everyone knows, people are iron, food is steel, and the bed is a magnet." She paused, then as if remembering something important, she added fiercely, "Don't you dare say I'm not a person." "All right," Edwina replied after a moment of silence. Alice then cheered up. She looked around and asked, "Are we going to eat breakfast?" Edwina nodded calmly. "Yay." Alice gave a small cheer, then looked at Edwina with an expectant gaze. She was soon led by Edwina to the dining room and enjoyed a sumptuous breakfast. After breakfast, for the crew of the Golden Dream, it was the most difficult time of the day. During this time, Edwina would check the crew's understanding of yesterday's knowledge, using methods including but not limited to questions, assignments, and tests. The pirate ship had turned from a free vessel into a prison on the sea. Alice secretly glanced at everyone's test papers and assignments, realizing that the knowledge they were learning was far more profound than she had thought. Edwina seemed to be seriously teaching the crew mysticism knowledge. Of course, most importantly, Alice noticed that these assignments and test papers were not uniform, meaning everyone's learning progress was not entirely the same, and Edwina was likely teaching in batches. She was truly skilled at being a teacher. But this gave Alice an idea. For example, if everyone's progress was different, could she possibly get the test papers and answers for the next exam in advance? Oh, speaking of which, could she divine the answers? Even anti-divination shouldn't be of much use against her. Alice fell into contemplation. She hadn't come up with a result yet when the morning study session ended, because there was a bonfire party tonight, and Edwina decided to let everyone rest for the day. Upon hearing this news, everyone except Dunitz looked at Alice with a mix of gratitude and joy, as if she were the benefactor of the entire ship. Only Dunitz's indignant voice stood out, "Don't let her trick all of you." The effect of these words wasn't strong. After all, up until now, Alice's image on the Golden Dream was still that of a peculiar little girl, who seemed to enjoy pranks, but wasn't Dunitz there for that? Aside from Edwina and Dunitz, no one else had realized how human-like Alice was yet. In fact, apart from Edwina, no one had yet discovered that Alice, who ate and slept on time, was actually an angel. And after realizing that Alice was well adapted to this atmosphere and had no intention of revealing it herself, Edwina also had no plans to tell anyone else. It wouldn't do any good anyway, it would only make everyone nervous. Edwina shook her head, gesturing for Alice, who was enjoying the spectacle, to follow her. Alice, who was contemplating cheating methods, offered no rebuttal and guiltily followed Edwina's footsteps. "Did you read the book I gave you yesterday? What did you think?" Edwina asked as they walked. Alice didn't seem guilty about this question. She habitually nodded, then realized Edwina hadn't looked back at her, so she cleared her throat and said, "I read it. I read The Life and Lies of Rosal Gustav. The content was very interesting, but some things had too much subjective speculation from the author." It shouldn't be true, right? I feel like some of the content was deliberately slandering Rosal, and the author's impression of Rosal probably isn't very good. Actually, you can tell that from the title. Also, the book tasted a bit sour, and it had a damp, musty smell. It felt like it had been on the ship for a long time, and the texture was soft and mushy. Don't you usually take it out to air it? Past experiences had made Alice shed some of her habit of speaking without thinking. She didn't mention that she could understand Rosal's diary, nor did she add defenses like, he didn't write it like that in his diary, to her words. But she overlooked another crucial point. Edwina stopped at the end of her words, turned back with a slight hesitation, and asked with doubt and confusion in her voice. Texture. Taste. End of chapter. Chapter 310. Chapter 184. The Legend of the Superpower. Alice froze for 2 seconds, then covered her mouth with her hand, staring at Edwina with innocent white eyes. Edwina met her gaze for more than 10 seconds, realizing that Alice was indeed very good at feigning innocence. So, she slightly emphasized her tone and asked again. Texture. Taste. Alice remained silent for 2 seconds, then her left hand naturally dropped, her right hand raised, palm outward, 3 fingers together, thumb and pinky bent close to her palm. Then, she said firmly. I promise, the book is exactly the same as when I first got it. Edwina recalled the sleeve that had no difference in creases from its original state. She looked at Alice, her brows furrowing slightly, and fell into thought. After being stared at by Edwina for over 10 seconds, Alice finally couldn't bear the pressure. She quietly put her hands behind her back and lowered her head guiltily. Edwina felt she completely understood what had happened. She took a deep breath and asked in as gentle a voice as possible. Why did you do that? Because. Alice cautiously raised her eyes to peek. After confirming that Edwina at least didn't look angry, she stammered an explanation. I wanted to taste what a book tasted like. Edwina's expression didn't change, and her voice remained gentle as she continued to ask, why would you have such a thought? This attitude somewhat put Alice at ease. She gave up her escape posture, fidgeting with the corner of her clothes as she explained. Because I hoped that if I ate the book, I would gain knowledge, and then I thought of. The entire logical chain connected. Edwina looked at Alice and smiled, saying, there really were people in the church who did such research. Alice's eyes widened, and she looked up in surprise. Seeing her expression, Edwina understood she was interested, so she continued. A saint of the church was once curious about the same question as you. After research, he invented a magic spell. This magic can be cast on ink, injecting one's own knowledge into the ink. As long as the ink is drunk, the knowledge injected by the caster can be mastered. Leaving aside the taste of the ink for now, after multiple experimental verifications, the effectiveness of this magic was confirmed. For a period after that, this magic was very popular within the church. Everyone liked to transmit knowledge in this way, and I also once received and transmitted knowledge in this way. However, everyone quickly discovered that after our bodies expelled the ink, the knowledge also left with the ink. Alice fell into deep thought. Edwina then asked, if you want to try it, there should be some ink in the captain's cabin, and I also mastered this magic. Do you want to try it? Alice decisively shook her head, then asked curiously, then isn't this magic very, very useless? Edwina shook her head and said, for ordinary beyonders, it is indeed as Emperor Rosal said, useless, tasteless to eat, and a pity to discard. But for a reader, it's not like that. Alice was slightly startled. She ignored Emperor Rosal, who was mentioned everywhere, and looked at Edwina, who didn't intend to elaborate, asking curiously. Are you like the mystery prior, where to a certain extent, knowledge represents power? After a pause, she suddenly remembered that Edwina could imitate Beander abilities she had seen. A flash of inspiration struck her, and she blurted out. The prerequisite for you to imitate Beander abilities is not having seen them, but having a full understanding of them, which is knowledge. This time it was Edwina's turn to be surprised. The conditions she provided were clearly not enough to deduce this result, and even the intermediate steps of the latter steps seemed very forced. Such a leap-forward way of thinking was clearly fundamentally different from the step-by-step logic of a detective. She was more like directly holding the answer and searching for the process. After glancing at Alice, Edwina realized this might be the particularity of the fate pathway. The excessively high spirituality and spiritual intuition brought not only danger but also that subtle sense of connection. Sometimes, without divination, they could guess the answers to some things. This was a reasoning process guided by intuition. Similarly, this irrational and illogical way of thinking was also more suitable for interpreting language. Edwina thoughtfully glanced at Alice. She didn't explicitly admit it, but she also didn't deny it. Instead, she smiled and asked about another matter. What is the origin of that gesture you just made? Questions about Rosal surged to Alice's lips but were swallowed back. She clearly realized that whether Rosal had said it or not, asking this question would be equivalent to giving Edwina a clear clue. Alice didn't care if the Tarot Club members knew about Rosal's connection to her or them. After all, they wouldn't dare to spread rumors. But Edwina, the precedent of the hermit Catlia, left a deep impression on Alice. She realized these adults weren't much better than her, a child, at keeping promises. No, perhaps even worse than her. Tisk, hypocritical adults. Alice spat fiercely in her heart before speaking. This is a Boy Scout oath gesture. I don't remember which country's Boy Scouts it was, and even if I told you, you wouldn't know. In the version I saw, the 3 fingers held together represent loyalty, friendship, and courage, respectively. Boy Scouts. This was a completely unfamiliar term. Alice combined child and army to form a phrase, and Edwina could roughly understand what she meant, an army of children. But, letting children join the army. Although there were no child protection laws in this era, and no one cared about children's human rights, in a situation where Beyonder armies were prevalent, Edwina couldn't imagine what an army composed of children could be used for. This sounded more like a game. However, Alice's words were enough for Edwina to make some conjectures. Before the first epoch, did a civilization exist? Alice's eyes widened. This was indistinguishable from a confirmation. Edwina continued to ask, were there many countries in that civilization? Alice pursed her lips. Given this, Edwina curiously asked the question she was most concerned about just now. Would that civilization let children join the army? From your description, it seems more than one country would do this. After more than 10 seconds of silence, Alice looked up and said with a sincere expression. At that time, the Beyonder was not a game for a few. Everyone would awaken unique powers at the age of 18 and be conscripted into the army. At that time, we called these people superpowers. End of this chapter. Alice was silent for 2 seconds, then her left hand naturally dropped, her right hand raised, palm outward, 3 fingers together, thumb and pinky bent close to her palm. Then, she said firmly, I promise, the book is exactly the same as when I first got it. Edwina recalled the sleeve that had no difference in creases from its original state. She looked at Alice, her brows furrowing slightly, and fell into thought. After being stared at by Edwina for over 10 seconds, Alice finally couldn't bear the pressure. She quietly put her hands behind her back and lowered her head guiltily. Edwina felt she completely understood what had happened. She took a deep breath and asked in as gentle a voice as possible. Why did you do that? Because. Alice cautiously raised her eyes to peek. After confirming that Edwina at least didn't look angry, she stammered an explanation. I wanted to taste what a book tasted like. Edwina's expression didn't change, and her voice remained gentle as she continued to ask, why would you have such a thought? This attitude somewhat put Alice at ease. She gave up her escape posture, fidgeting with the corner of her clothes as she explained. Because I hoped that if I ate the book, I would gain knowledge, and then I thought of. The entire logical chain connected. Edwina looked at Alice and smiled, saying, there really were people in the church who did such research. Alice's eyes widened, and she looked up in surprise. Seeing her expression, Edwina understood she was interested, so she continued. A saint of the church was once curious about the same question as you. He, after research, invented a magic spell. This magic can be cast on ink, injecting one's own knowledge into the ink. As long as the ink is drunk, the knowledge injected by the caster can be mastered. Leaving aside the taste of the ink for now, after multiple experimental verifications, the effectiveness of this magic was confirmed. For a period after that, this magic was very popular within the church. Everyone liked to transmit knowledge in this way, and I also once received and transmitted knowledge in this way, however. Everyone quickly discovered that after our bodies expelled the ink, the knowledge also left with the ink. Alice fell into deep thought. Edwina then asked, "If you want to try it, there should be some ink in the captain's cabin, and I also mastered this magic. Do you want to try it?" Alice decisively shook her head, then asked curiously, "Then isn't this magic very, very useless?" Edwina shook her head and said, "For ordinary beyonders, it is indeed as Emperor Rosal said, useless, tasteless to eat, and a pity to discard. But for a reader, it's not like that." Alice was slightly startled. She ignored Emperor Rosal, who was mentioned everywhere, and looked at Edwina, who didn't intend to elaborate, asking curiously, "Are you like the mystery prior, where to a certain extent, knowledge represents power?" After a pause, she suddenly remembered that Edwina could imitate Beyander abilities she had seen. A flash of inspiration struck her, and she blurted out, "The prerequisite for you to imitate Beyander abilities is not having seen them, but having a full understanding of them, which is knowledge." This time it was Edwina's turn to be surprised. The conditions she provided were clearly not enough to deduce this result, and even the intermediate steps of the latter steps seemed very forced. Such a leap-forward way of thinking was clearly fundamentally different from the step-by-step logic of a detective. She was more like directly holding the answer and searching for the process. After glancing at Alice, Edwina realized this might be the particularity of the fate pathway. The excessively high spirituality and spiritual intuition brought not only danger but also that subtle sense of connection. Sometimes, without divination, they could guess the answers to some things. This was a reasoning process guided by intuition. Similarly, this irrational and illogical way of thinking was also more suitable for interpreting language. Edwina thoughtfully glanced at Alice. She didn't explicitly admit it, but she also didn't deny it. Instead, she smiled and asked about another matter. "What is the origin of that gesture you just made?" Questions about Rosal surged to Alice's lips but were swallowed back. She clearly realized that whether Rosal had said it or not, asking this question would be equivalent to giving Edwina a clear clue. Alice didn't care if the Tarot Club members knew about Rosal's connection to her or them. After all, they wouldn't dare to spread rumors. But Edwina, the precedent of the hermit Catlia, left a deep impression on Alice. She realized these adults weren't much better than her, a child, at keeping promises. No, perhaps even worse than her. Tisk, hypocritical adults. Alice spat fiercely in her heart before speaking. "This is a Boy Scout oath gesture. I don't remember which country's Boy Scouts it was, and even if I told you, you wouldn't know. In the version I saw, the 3 fingers held together represent loyalty, friendship, and courage, respectively. Boy Scouts. This was a completely unfamiliar term. Alice combined child and army to form a phrase, and Edwina could roughly understand what she meant, an army of children. But letting children join the army. Although there were no child protection laws in this era, and no one cared about children's human rights, in a situation where Beyander armies were prevalent, Edwina couldn't imagine what an army composed of children could be used for. This sounded more like a game. However, Alice's words were enough for Edwina to make some conjectures. Before the first epoch, did a civilization exist? Alice's eyes widened. This was indistinguishable from a confirmation. Edwina continued to ask, were there many countries in that civilization? Alice pursed her lips. Given this, Edwina curiously asked the question she was most concerned about just now. Would that civilization let children join the army? From your description, it seems more than one country would do this. Alice remained silent for more than 10 seconds, then looked up and said with a sincere expression. At that time, the Beyander was not a game for a few. Everyone would awaken unique powers at the age of 18 and be conscripted into the army. At that time, we called these people superpowers. End of this chapter. Chapter 311, Chapter 185, Desire. Edwina knew Alice was spouting nonsense. Her expression, her movements, her demeanor all indicated it. But she was exceptionally serious. However, there are also some special people who receive acceptance letters from magic schools at 11, and some become magical girls at 12. If none of that happens, then they just have to wait until they're 18, and based on their different talents, go to university at Castle College or Miskatonic. Note 1. Meeting Alice's serious gaze, Edwina deeply regretted the question she had just asked. She had to start considering which of Alice's words were true and which were false. She decided to discuss another matter with Alice first. Alice, if you find staying on the Golden Dream boring, you can leave anytime, alright. Alice's movements paused slightly, and she asked hesitantly, did Gehrman tell you to say that to me? Yes, Edwina nodded candidly. He said his intention wasn't to restrict your freedom. If you truly don't like it, you can go. Alice knew what Klein meant. The St. Fouerin incident had not long passed, and Klein was afraid of a second St. Fouerin appearing. Actually, even if they encountered the same situation, the Golden Dream wouldn't become the next St. Fouerin. There weren't that many ordinary people as tourists here. As this thought arose, Alice pushed it back down. She understood that such words should never be spoken, because humans wouldn't like her making such comparisons, at least Klein wouldn't. However, Alice still had to speak for herself. Even if I do nothing, the sea isn't always calm. Her voice gradually faded, finally disappearing. She suddenly realized that such a secret seemed impossible for her to keep. Oh, this. Alice silently lowered her head and quickly concluded the topic. I understand. After getting her answer, Edwina said nothing more and let her leave. Alice immediately ran off to bother the idle crew members. Subsequently, for the rest of the time before nightfall, Edwina was deep in thought. Facing a problem that divination couldn't answer, Edwina found a solution before the bonfire party arrived. She truthfully reported the information about the civilization before the first epoch that Alice had mentioned, just as she reported the progress of her contact with Gehrman. At the bonfire party that night, Alice sighed in disappointment, not getting to see Edwina's troubled expression as she had hoped. This was her last day of happiness. After finishing the mysticism class the next morning, Alice felt that this journey was truly too dull, which was why Edwina could so calmly teach the crew. Alice really wanted to do something, but having just agreed to something, she couldn't immediately go back on her word. Moreover, even if she were to break the agreement, someone else should break it first, so she could legitimately cause trouble. Time flowed slowly during Alice's painful wait. This Sunday, the Golden Dream returned to Byam. To Alice's surprise, when they returned to land, the first thing these pirates did wasn't to seek entertainment at the Red Theater. Well, that might be because of Edwina. Nor was it to gamble. Oh, that might also be because of Edwina. In any case, at Alice's request and threat, Dunnits took Alice to a Beander gathering. This was somewhat different from the previous loose gathering, closer to the feeling of a Bravehearts bar gathering, but the difference was that the disguises to conceal appearances were self-provided. Theoretically, one could choose not to conceal, but one of the conditions Dunnits agreed to was that Alice must completely cover herself from face to figure. His exact words were, "Taking a young girl your age out in Byam, I'd be Byam's headline the next day." Alice had wanted to say she had ways to make people not notice her, but she suddenly remembered her appearance with Gehrman Sparrow, who was Klein in disguise, and corrected Dunnits. Don't worry, you won't become famous because of this. Everyone will just think you stole Gehrman Sparrow's lover, or abducted his family member or something. In short, after this conversation, at Dunnits's strong insistence, Alice used a wide warlock's robe and a mask to cover her face in her peculiar outfit, appearing at the Beander gathering. The gathering started at 9 in the evening. As the time approached, more and more people came in. Just as Alice was boredly playing a game of wrapping her hand in her sleeve and then suddenly extending it, her spirituality was suddenly stirred again. Why does it feel like my spirituality is constantly being stirred in strange places lately? Alice grumbled inwardly as she pulled her hand back into her sleeve and looked up. Coincidentally, someone pushed the door open and entered. That person was wearing a similar black robe. Alice even suspected they had just bought them from the same shop. This mysterious person was holding a book with an ocean blue cover, with faint silver patterns along the edges, but the dim environment and distance prevented her from seeing the specific details clearly. It was this book that stirred Alice's spirituality. The mysterious person sat down in a seat behind and opposite Alice, with most of their body obscured by the people in front. Alice only saw the mysterious person sit in the seat for about 10 seconds, then place the book on their lap and slowly open it. Can one really see the words in this kind of light? Alice looked doubtfully at the dim light around her, then refocused her gaze on the opposite side. The mysterious person had already closed the book. With the hood and mask together obscuring their face, Alice couldn't see the mysterious person's features. When turning the pages, the mysterious person's hand extended from their sleeve, but besides a pair of black gloves, Alice couldn't discern anything else. Alice had no choice but to refocus her gaze on the book. The ocean blue cover was incredibly beautiful. The more Alice looked, the more enchanting she found it, unconsciously falling into its allure. That color, so close to the sea, made Alice subconsciously recall the deep-sea delicious fish she had eaten on the ship a few days ago, and then the Rosal Gustav's Life and Lies that she had taken a few bites of. Perhaps the bad taste was the book's problem. Like this book looks delicious. Alice subconsciously licked her lips, and a familiar yet strange craving gradually welled up in her heart. Just then, the second hand of the clock completed its last tick, and 9 o'clock officially arrived. The initiator, seated in the center of the gathering, cleared their throat lightly and slowly announced in a hoarse voice. Let's begin. End of chapter. Chapter 312. Chapter 186. A magical item with no negative effects. What the hell? Alice snapped awake at the sound, her gaze shifting from delicious, tempting food to a terrifying monster when she looked at the book. That sense of craving didn't come from her body, Alice knew that clearly. She had experienced that craving from the depths of her spirituality many times. Past experiences told her it was an instinct for aggregation. After recovering the uniqueness, this instinct was, to a certain extent, under control. At least, low and mid-sequence potions and Beander characteristics no longer held much attraction for her. But facing high-sequence Beander characteristics, Alice could still feel that hunger from the depths of her spirituality, just like that book. What the hell was that thing? Alice lost interest in listening to others' transactions. She reached out and grabbed Dunnetz's arm beside her, and, under his puzzled gaze, she gave him a hard pinch through his clothes. Dog. The syllable of an insult barely escaped before Dunnetz swallowed it back, but based on experience, Alice believed Dunnetz had intended to say, dog shit. Dunnetz turned his head. He wore a hood and mask identical to Alice's, which was clearly not his intention, but at that moment, close enough, Alice could see his exposed eyes were filled with fury. That bit of anger quickly dissipated. Dunnetz felt a momentary daze, and then Alice's voice echoed in his mind. If I suddenly stand up later or something, remember to hold me back. This was a technique Alice had developed for using her authority while researching exam cheating methods, passing notes. After all, if she could use divination to search for answers online, how could there be no passing notes? Even for cheat sheets, Alice had found suitable substitutes, the knowledge ink mentioned by Edwina. The only drawback was that Alice hadn't yet found a way for notes to be passed back and forth. Currently, only she could send them. Dunnetz couldn't even ask her why at this moment. Unless he prayed to her. Alice had originally intended to bring Yordson in as a partner, but after asking, she learned that a Sequence 6 Prometheus couldn't steal thoughts or ideas. Sigh, she missed Eamon. I need the potion formula for the Marauder Pathways Sequence 7. A hoarse, unpleasant voice interrupted Alice's thoughts of Eamon. Alice was reminded of the witch in fairy tales. She looked up and saw that the speaker was the owner of that book. Sequence 7. Marauder. Could she be a swindler? The moment this sequence came to mind, Alice almost uncontrollably recalled Sylvia Maloney's face. Clearly, she only knew one swindler. Those who had already advanced or died didn't count. No, this one was actually a suspected swindler, but it didn't matter. Better to kill by mistake than to let go. No, it wasn't because she coveted that book, it really wasn't. Alice's gaze flickered, and she lowered her head to ponder. Regardless of how she would get that book later, now she could actually try selling the cryptologist potion formula first. Or rather, the acquisition channel. She could just let her go dig up Amon's grave. Alice's eyes darted, and she raised her hand to speak. I don't have the potion formula you want, but I know where to find, the Marauders Sequence 7, called Cryptologist. To gain trust, Alice revealed the name of the Sequence 7. As for how the mysterious person would judge its authenticity, that was too obvious. Alice wasn't at all puzzled by it. The book she held in her arms was a high-sequence mystical item of the Fate pathway. She just didn't know which sequence it was. First, rule out Sequence 1. They faced each other from across the room, separated by others. Alice saw that the mysterious person didn't immediately respond. Instead, she sat silently for a few seconds, then opened the book on her lap, glanced down, and then looked up and said, "How much do you want?" Alice silently turned to look at Dunitz. After 2 seconds of blankness, Dunitz realized he was the one in charge of negotiating. Looking into Alice's eyes, Dunitz thought he should indeed be more reliable than Alice in this regard. He turned his head and said with a commanding presence, "A sequence 7 potion formula is at least £750, and for someone in urgent need, it can even sell for over £1,000. Of course, if it's just a clue, it should be cheaper." "But the potion formula she wants is very rare," Alice interrupted Dunitz. "The number of wild marauders is far scarcer than you think, you'll hardly ever see them outside." She paused, then smiled as she looked at the book with the ocean blue cover, and softly said, "I guess without it, you wouldn't have found this place." "It's her," the mysterious person subconsciously corrected. "No matter how rare, it's still sequence 7, and what you can offer is only a clue." Her. Alice acutely noticed this detail, but she merely smiled and said, "I can guarantee that my clue is definitely effective. You can 100% advance to cryptologist based on my clue." Even directly to a demigod, Alice muttered to herself, "How much do you want?" The mysterious person asked again. Alice replied with a curve of her lips, £750. This takes into account that this clue will likely require a little help from the book in your hands. Of course, if you trust me, I don't mind helping, and I won't charge money. And then take something else. Alice swept an ambiguous glance at the book. The mysterious person immediately hugged the book to her chest, protecting it tightly, and then said with displeasure, "Deal. Write your clue on a note and pass it over." She cared a lot about that book. Alice looked at her thoughtfully and began to write the clue on paper. In the 4th epoch, during the Tudor dynasty, there existed an Aemon family. This was one of the 5 great families that supported the establishment of the Tudor dynasty, and it was also a marauder family. Currently, this family has vanished in the tide of time, and its members have gone into hiding, but their mausoleum still exists. Go to the Aemon family's mausoleum, you will definitely find what you want there, and perhaps you might even find other treasures. After writing this, Alice reread it, and after confirming there were no other issues, she handed the note to the attendant. Speaking of which, no matter what sequence the Beander item is, it should more or less detect that this clue has a problem, right? No, the fact that this thing led her to me is already a big problem, isn't it? Alice watched as the mysterious person took the note, opened the book again, and after confirmation, counted out £750 in banknotes to the attendant, slowly frowning. As a sequence 8 Beander, she was frequently using a high-sequence mystical item, and she didn't seem at all worried about negative side effects. Why was that? End of chapter. Chapter 313. Chapter 187. Our paths will eventually cross again. Actually, there was more than just that one peculiar detail, for instance, Thuddish, and how she had to flip open that book and glance at it no matter what she was doing. She seemed to trust and rely on that book immensely. Perhaps this was a side effect. Alice began to look at the book with a wary gaze. Alice maintained her high level of vigilance until the gathering ended. The person in charge of the gathering arranged for them to leave in batches through the back door. Alice, who hadn't had a chance to do anything, felt a pang of regret. Alice happened to be among the first few to leave. When she stood up, the mysterious person was still seated in her chair. She had to lower her head, trying her best to suppress that regretful yet longing gaze. As she followed the attendant along the long and winding passage to the exit, watching the attendant turn back, Alice suddenly realized that no one would see her departure route, and naturally, no one would see whether she had actually left. Alice licked her lips. She walked forward about 4 or 5 meters more before silently disappearing. She had discussed it with Dunitz beforehand, telling him not to worry about where she went after coming out, so she wasn't concerned about Dunitz not finding her if he came out. Well, she probably wouldn't have worried even if they hadn't discussed it. This was not as important to Alice as what the mysterious person actually looked like. Too lazy to move, Alice simply waited in place until the attendant finally brought out the mysterious person. Her eyes lit up, and she followed. The mysterious person had not removed her hood and mask. After walking a few steps, holding the book, she stopped, looked around, and asked in the same hoarse, unpleasant voice as before. "Oh, my dear child, don't hide. The trajectory of fate has exposed you. Your secrets, your doubts, cannot be concealed. Come out, child, let us together unveil the veil of fate and jointly face the coming storms." Alice felt a question mark slowly appear above her head. Why do I feel like she's more like Miss Fate than I am? Alice silently lowered her head and began to self-reflect in place. After asking the question, the mysterious person waited in place. After a few minutes, she spoke with a somewhat regretful tone. "It seems you are not yet ready to reveal yourself, but that's all right. The gears of fate have already begun to turn, and our paths will eventually converge again. At that time, you will have no choice but to face me. At that time, I will reveal hidden secrets to you." Alice looked up at the figure in disbelief. The figure did not stop, nor did she panic. She still held the book, walking away at an unhurried pace. Alice did not chase after her. It wasn't that she hadn't reacted, but rather, when the mysterious person spoke those words, she acutely sensed a fluctuation of fate. That was a prophecy. But, Alice murmured to herself, looking at the empty alley, if the book in your hand comes from a soothsayer, then, we were bound to meet again anyway. She shook her head, but did not return to the golden dream. Instead, she returned to her home in Backland. After all, she was preparing to contact Eamon. In doing such a thing on the golden dream, it would be awkward if she really synthesized an Eamon there. Alice shook her head and began to think about what to say. Using a prayer ritual? No, too long. I'll write a letter instead. And if I write a letter, Eamon will at least have to finish reading it before he comes to settle accounts with me. Alice found paper and pen and began to deliberate her wording. Open black lens bracket. Delicious worm of time. It's been a long time since I last saw you. Last time we met, you said you were looking for ingredients nearby. How was it? Any harvest? It doesn't matter if you didn't. I certainly didn't find any suitable ingredients for you. However, this might count as a little seasoning. Oh, yes, I discovered a swindler. She is seeking the cryptologist's potion formula, so I told her to go on an adventure to your mausoleum. There must be what she wants there, and perhaps she can even find extra treasures, such as yourself. I mean, would you like to set up a mausoleum for her to dig around in? I remember you have a mausoleum in Backland. At that time, you could lie in the coffin, then suddenly open your eyes and sit up or something. Horror movies often do that, though that usually involves a corpse reanimating. Finally, please, when you do this, be sure to bring me. Actually, I want to prepare a camera to film the scene of you sitting up. It could also be something else, such as pushing up a monocle, or suddenly opening your eyes and smiling. In short, it must be a classic horror movie scene, which might even become a popular meme in our era. Unfortunately, cameras of this era cannot record videos. Enclosed with this letter is your labor and performance fee of £50. Your devoted friend, Alice. Close black lens bracket. Alice put down her pen, exhaled softly, and looked at the letter paper, stroking her chin, murmuring. I always feel like something is missing. This is too plain, there should be some illustrations. Alice had a sudden realization. After rereading the letter, she recalled the appearance of fried insects in her memory, as well as the appearance of the worm of time. After a brief thought, she drew a worm of time on the letter paper. Afterward, she found another piece of drawing paper and drew a plate of golden, appetizing fried worm of time. Yes, she colored it. After pressing the drawing paper on the desk to dry and placing the letter beside it, Alice thought for a moment and then returned to the golden dream to sleep. She woke up after only a few hours. It was not yet 5 in the morning in Byam, it was still dark, and no one was awake. This was perfect for Alice. She needed to deliver the items to Eamon and then send away the potentially arriving Eamon before anyone else woke up. Returning to Backland, where dawn was even further away, Alice confidently set up the ritual and handed everything over to Eamon. After reading Alice's letter, Eamon ignored the strange salutation at the beginning and the drawing of the fried worm of time. These were essential features of every letter from Alice, and Eamon had learned to disregard them. He was saving up the accounts to settle them all at once. Seriously, the most speechless part of this letter for Eamon was that Alice had actually enclosed £50 in banknotes. Insane. Eamon held the 50 pounds, unsure for a moment whether he should return it. According to his principles, money that reached his hands could never be returned, but the problem was, this was a gift from fate. If it had been stolen, that would be one thing, but such an obvious gift. Eamon raised his eyebrows, trying to analyze Alice's thinking. She should be considered to be asking for help. That swindler has something she wants. Eamon reread Alice's letter and suddenly revealed a mischievous smile. End of chapter. Chapter 314. Chapter 188. Shoddy construction. After Alice had been lying down for nearly 3 hours, she felt that Eamon probably wouldn't come looking for her. It seemed he also didn't intend to return the money. She'd just assume he agreed. Alice happily made the decision for Eamon, then returned to the Golden Dream. It was close to 8 in the morning, the sun had already risen, and it was breakfast time. Alice pretended she had just woken up and skipped cheerfully to the restaurant for breakfast. The pirates on holiday finally recreated the scene Alice remembered. What decent person on holiday not only gets up early but also eats in the cafeteria obediently? Yes, Alice was the only one in the entire restaurant, there wasn't even anyone cooking. After 2 seconds of silence, Alice quietly retreated and began to ponder what she should do. After staring awestruck in the direction of the captain's cabin for over 10 seconds, Alice suddenly remembered Dunnetz's words from last night. If she was really that conspicuous in Byam, wouldn't she and Klein have some strange rumors circulating? After all, Olivie was right next to Byam, and if she remembered correctly, the Sweet Lemon Bar was Olivie's most famous gathering spot for adventurers. A strong sense of worry suddenly surged in Alice's heart. Thankfully, Klein was volunteering and didn't know about this, haha. Alice reached out and covered her face. After more than 10 seconds, she decided to investigate the extent and scope of the rumors spread. She still concealed her presence. After a brief thought, she realized she knew nothing about Byam's taverns. She'd see where Dunnetz and the others went. Black Forest Bar. Alice stood at the entrance of the tavern, read the name aloud, and poked her head in as she walked inside. Alice had originally intended to secretly look for Dunnetz and the others. In the divination, Dunnetz was with Jordson, Flower Bowtie, Brewalls, Gourmet, Orpheus, Singer, and Daniels, Bucket, among others. Before Alice even had a chance to glance around the tavern, she heard Dunnetz's exceptionally flamboyant voice. Don't be fooled by her face. She's Gehrman Sparrow, that lunatic's lover. Alice gritted her teeth and looked over in the direction of the voice. The few people were sitting together as shown in the divination results. Jordson and Brewalls seemed quite sober, Orpheus and Daniels looked a little tipsy, and Dunnetz felt like he had been plied with drinks. It seemed that alcohol attacks were still effective against low and mid-sequence beyonders. Alice shook her head and approached silently. She placed her hand on Dunnetz's shoulder from behind him, simultaneously canceling her hidden state, and used restart to make Dunnetz tipsy. After glancing around, she looked at Dunnetz, who had turned his head, and leaned in with a smile, asking, "Are you sober?" Alice only pulled back part of his sanity from the alcohol. Dunnetz still felt his head was like a muddle, his body light. Alice's voice reached his ears, and he nodded dully. "You're sober now." Alice raised her tone, withdrew the hand she had extended, and put it behind her back with the other. Behind her back, she pinched her left wrist with her right hand. At the same time, a chandelier in the tavern crashed down. Amidst people's terrified screams, the splashing fragments seemed to consciously avoid everyone except Dunnetz. This wasn't all. Dunnetz's remaining chair finally reached the end of its lifespan and disintegrated directly. Losing support, Dunnetz fell towards the ground, but a wooden stick coincidentally stood in place, and Dunnetz landed directly on it. At the same time, the wine glass he was holding also slipped to the ground, fragments and wine splashing out, a good deal of it onto him. This was perhaps just an appetizer. The falling chandelier was just a short distance beside Dunnetz. More than half of the splashing fragments flew towards his face. Under the influence of alcohol, facing this series of changes, Dunnetz only managed to close his eyes. Ah! He let out a sharp, tragic cry. Alice frowned and covered her ears. The fragments that were fixed on Dunnetz's face and body, as well as the fragments that were falling, seemed to be controlled by an invisible force, returning along their original trajectories, reassembling into a complete chandelier, and rehanging from the ceiling. The wine glass and chair also returned to their original state. Dunitz seemed to be lifted by an invisible force, sitting back on the chair, without any injuries on his body. It was as if nothing had happened. That chandelier, in the dead silence, Alice pointed to the chandelier closest to the dance floor, is about to fall. Remember to fix it. Okay. Someone at the front desk nodded subconsciously. Alice then turned her head and gave Dunitz a kind smile, successfully making Dunitz shiver. She tilted her head and looked around, then trotted to the next table, gave them an apologetic smile amidst their terrified gazes, and then carried away an unused empty chair. She sat next to Dunitz with the chair and turned her head, smiling as she said, "Keep talking." Dunitz swallowed with difficulty twice. Alice maintained her harmless smile and said, "You wouldn't think what just happened had anything to do with me, would you? That was just your bad luck. I kindly helped you. You should thank me properly, and then reflect on what you did to displease our great Miss Fate, shouldn't you?" Alice's attention was not on the others. The briefly stunned guests quickly recovered, whispering to those around them with lingering fear, while also pricking up their ears to listen to their conversation. Displeased the great Miss Fate. "Hey, do you remember that prophecy from the ticket company, the one about the Saint Fuerin?" Someone whispered to their companion. I remember. His companion also whispered in agreement. "That ritual-like scene, I'm very impressed by it. That Wheel of Fortune card, hey, why did she say the owner of that prophecy was a girl? She might not necessarily be talking about that," another person at the table quietly reminded. "It could just be a metaphor, like when we say the goddess of luck or something." Alice, who wanted to hear her own gossip but heard something else, quietly withdrew her attention, glanced at Dunitz, and then blinked, saying, "You really need to think carefully, because, next time, it might be a meteorite that falls." Before Dunitz could speak, Alice looked up at the ceiling again and muttered to herself, "Forget it, given the shoddy construction of this bar, I might as well just let the ceiling collapse than waste that effort." End of chapter. Chapter 315 Chapter 189 Encounter. No one understood Alice's strange analogy, at least Dunitz didn't, but those who did understand looked worriedly at the ceiling. It wouldn't really collapse, would it? After confirming she had no intention of continuing her antics and seemed to have vented her anger, the social butterfly, no, flower bowtie, Yordson offered her a drink, smiling as he consoled her. Don't mind him. Dunitz was just drunk and talking nonsense. Don't be angry, it's not good for your health." Alice glanced at him, not taking the glass, and reminded him coldly, "Minors can't drink alcohol." They all fell silent, suddenly feeling that Dunitz's words just now were indeed a bit excessive, after all. "I don't understand," Alice's voice interrupted their thoughts. "Why do you all think I'm Gehrman's lover, and not that he's my lover?" Meeting her serious and confused gaze, Yordson hesitated for 2 seconds before asking, "So, is that really what's going on?" Alice was silent for a moment, then said with a smile, "No, I am a level 0 sealed artifact entrusted to him for safekeeping. Do you believe me?" After 2 seconds of silence, Yordson was the first to laugh at this joke, which was actually the truth. Immediately after, the others also started laughing. Alice stared at their smiles, thought for a few seconds, then turned to Dunitz and said, "Next time you're drunk and want to spout nonsense, say this instead. Isn't Gehrman Sparrow having a humanoid level 0 sealed artifact that can run, jump, and talk more exciting than him having an underage lover?" Dunitz froze in place, then hesitated and asked, "So, is that statement true?" Alice turned her head, smiled, and raised an eyebrow. "You guess." Dunitz didn't dare to guess, because the answer was already in his heart, because he had just directly experienced the threat of death. He truly empathized with the ants he casually crushed. Alice understood with a single glance that her intimidation had succeeded. At least she wouldn't hear such nonsense about her being someone's lover from Dunitz's mouth again, and most likely, this group of pirates wouldn't either. As for the others, she'd beat up anyone she saw. Sigh, if only it could be set to automatically trigger when others say similar things, then I wouldn't have to deal with it. Hey, can Adam do something like that? But it's not comprehensive, and Adam can only perceive it, he can't execute the next step. Is there a way to connect a fixed event to a certain fixed destiny? For example, connecting spreading rumors with the destiny of death. No, from a human value perspective, for mere rumor spreading, such a punishment is too severe. So, is there a way? Alice, lost in thought, shook her head, deciding not to think about it anymore. We'll see then. She happily made her decision, sprang up from her seat, and waved her hand amidst the puzzled gazes of the others, saying, "Bye-bye." Then she vanished from the spot. Alice certainly didn't teleport directly from the tavern to somewhere else. After all, she didn't know where to go. She merely concealed her form and slowly strolled away. But that was already enough to relax the atmosphere in the tavern. By the time she reached the door, the surroundings had become completely noisy. Alice shook her head, quickening her pace to get away from the center of the noise, but looked up to find someone just about to enter. The newcomer was a man with black hair and blue eyes, his hair a bit disheveled. He was wearing a formal tailcoat, but only one button of his outer coat was fastened, and his cufflinks weren't fastened at all. His spirituality was leaking out. Alice knew without even looking that he was a newly promoted Sequence 9 Beander. Light-footed, wearing leather shoes but walking almost silently. Is the enhancement related to agility? Alice raised an eyebrow, not dwelling on it. She scanned him again, found him somewhat familiar, and carefully recalled in her mind. Where had she seen him before? What's the most popular drink here? Of course, it's sweet lemon, the most popular in all of Olivie. Give me two. Aided by her spirituality, the familiar dialogue echoed in Alice's mind. The next scene after this dialogue was the owner of this familiar face. Back then, his hair was impeccably groomed, and only his shirt cuffs weren't fastened. Today, newly promoted to a Beander, perhaps a bit excited. Alice curiously glanced at his destination and, seeing that he had indeed joined the gamblers' camp again, she shifted her gaze away, uninterested. Speaking of which, he's gambled quite a few times, hasn't he? Last time I saw him, he was so nervous he was moving his arms and legs in sync. Now, even though it's not the same tavern, he seems very familiar with the layout. Is he going to a specialized casino next? After all, this little parlor game in the tavern is really not enough. If that's the case, he'll lose even his underwear next, won't he? Then I won't get to see him in this formal attire. Oh, I wouldn't have seen it anyway, it's not like we'd coincidentally run into each other every day. No, I can't say that either. For someone like Will Ossepton, and that book. If we're not careful, we really might run into each other every day. Wait, Will Ossepton probably wouldn't. If he were affected by the law of aggregation even in the womb, then Ouroboros would have caught him long ago, wouldn't he? This is like the positive and negative poles of a magnet. No, wait a minute, without Will Ossepton, wouldn't I be the one with the strongest attraction? Alice fell into deep thought. She finally had no time to worry about whether this stranger would lose even his underwear in the future. She began to worry about whether she herself would be swallowed whole by the snake of fate, underwear and all. It seems snakes usually swallow their prey whole and digest it slowly, and the snake of fate in her dream didn't seem to have teeth. If that's the case, once she's in the snake's belly, can she cut open its belly and escape? No, why run? Since I'm here, I might as well have some snake soup. No, wait, what am I thinking? Why am I comparing the snake of fate to an ordinary snake? Alice raised her hand to her head and brought it down hard, stopping just before it landed. Forget it, it hurts too much. Why hit myself? Instead, Alice's eyes darted around, and she retreated back into the Black Forest bar. Although Alice had left, her lingering influence remained. The table where the Golden Dream crew sat didn't dare to discuss topics related to her. Alice shook her head, raised her hand, and slapped Dunnits hard on the head. Hee. Ouch. In the noisy bar, Dunnits suddenly clutched his head and let out a yelp. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to make everyone nearby look at him. End of chapter. Chapter 316 Chapter 190 Birthday Gift. Alice, having finished her mischief, quietly left the Black Forest bar, her good deeds hidden deep. Bored, Alice, with the resolve to die rather than read a book, remembered something she had previously forgotten: her comic still needed an ending. Alice, who had become dedicated to her work because she didn't want to study, spent a morning and half an afternoon like this, even having lunch in between. It wasn't until 2:55 p.m., when she received a message from Klein, that Alice vaguely realized another week had passed. The year 1350 was not a leap year, and today was February 28, the last day of February. Mr. Fool's birthday was this Friday. Alice's eyes lit up as she realized she could start creating the Rosal's Diary series, The Taste of a Witch is Really Good, Faceless chapter. I'll copy a few pages in advance and sell them, so even if Klein finds out I wrote it and doesn't let me sell it, it'll be useless. Alice suppressed her restless heart and began to ponder another question. By the way, even though her birthday had passed, could she ask Klein for a belated gift? Alice blinked twice, starting to recall what she was doing on February 5th. This should have been 3 weeks ago, and that day should have been a Saturday. Alice's brow twitched violently. What was she doing 3 Saturdays ago? Aha, she arrived in Byam that evening and retrieved the uniqueness, damn it. Was this date a coincidence? If not, what was this? A birthday present. Song Shu's smiling face reappeared in her memory. Alice bit her teeth and looked up at Justice Audrey, who was greeting everyone. Audrey's voice was as cheerful as ever, she still seemed to have no worries. When Alice looked up, she had just turned from Hermit Catalia to Alice. Good afternoon, Miss Fate. Alice pulled her thoughts away from her previous emotions, curved her lips into a cold smile, and responded with little enthusiasm. Good afternoon. Miss Fate doesn't seem very happy, as if she has something on her mind. This thought flashed through Audrey's mind, but her smile and voice remained unchanged as she continued to greet everyone one by one as before. When she finished her greetings, no one had a diary to hand in, so Klein leaned back in his chair and said, "Let's begin." Seeing this, Alice was the first to raise her hand and asked, "Son, Derek, have you ever seen a similar building?" As she spoke, with Klein's help, she materialized a building standing in the solidified twilight. Derek's emotions visibly became agitated. Giant court. Only after shouting this did he realize his gaffe, and suppressing his emotions, he explained. That is the giant court, Miss Fate, have you come to our side?" "No," Alice shook her head, "I found a key, it seems to be related to this area of buildings." Derek's eyes widened. "If, as you say, that is the giant court, then it is related to the giant court." Alice stroked her chin. "Miss Fate, if I want to obtain it, what should I do?" Derek asked somewhat excitedly. Alice glanced at him, saying with a slight hesitation, "Can you enter the giant court?" Derek shook his head. Alice impatiently made the decision for him. "Then wait until you can enter." "Or, wait until I have money." Alice clenched her fist, remembering the idea of winning back a casino that Klein had stopped her from doing. She sighed silently, and after a moment of contemplation, she asked again. "Has anyone here heard the name, Cassandra?" Everyone looked at each other. Hermit Catalia thought for a moment and raised her hand, saying, "I heard a story where the protagonist was a soothsayer named Cassandra, but when I heard it at the time, I thought it was a fictional story." Princess Cassandra of Troy. Alice raised an eyebrow. "Yes, that's the story." Catalia nodded. "Miss Fate, Madam Hermit, what is that story?" Audrey asked curiously. Catalia looked at Alice. Alice didn't speak, but waved her hand, indicating she could go ahead. So Catalia recounted the entire story and at the end asked, "Miss Fate, is there anything wrong with this story?" Alice pinched her brow, looked at her, and asked, "When and where did you hear this story?" "It was during," Catalia recalled carefully, "a casual chat, someone mentioned it to me." Audrey curiously repeated Catalia's previous question, "Miss Fate, is there anything wrong with this story?" Alice looked up at her. Although Audrey didn't ask directly, Alice always felt like she was suspecting that she was the one who did it, though it really did sound like her style. No, how could such a thing be possible? That was clearly just a mythical creature story. Alice shook off this terrifying thought and shook her head, saying, "I just want to know the origin of this story. But I always feel like if I say that, they'll think I don't want to talk." Alice silently lowered her head and didn't ask any new questions. Since no one was in a hurry to purchase potion formulas and materials, nothing else important happened during the rest of the Tarot Club. After some casual chatting, Klein announced the end of the Tarot Club. Back in the real world, Alice began to ponder the content of her new diary. She still hadn't forgotten Klein's words. A seer at the faceless stage couldn't actually make significant changes to their body, not even changing their physique, let alone completely becoming a woman. Alice partially agreed with Klein's speculation. For example, a high-sequence faceless should be able to make significant adjustments to their physique. The reason it was only partial was because Alice had some doubts about the gender of high-sequence Beander. As Eamon said, for mythical creature, gender held no meaning. Considering the situation of the restart, Alice felt that the gender of a high-sequence Beander was probably still primarily determined by the Beander's own perception. Wait a minute, Demoness shouldn't be, right? Demoness and Iron-Blooded Knight shouldn't be. Their corresponding outer deity, could it be the legendary Hermaphrodite? After 2 seconds of dazed silence, Alice decided to focus on how to continue Rosal's diary. From the abilities of a faceless, it should be possible to create a face that perfectly matched Emperor Rosal's aesthetic. If he saw it, it felt like some things happening wouldn't be fictional, would they? Alice silently pulled out her pen. End of chapter. Chapter 317 Chapter 191 Birthday Gift. March 1st. Today, I met a beauty. I happily invited her to spend the night, but after she took off her clothes, I found out she was bigger than me. March 2nd. I mentioned this to Zeratul. He told me it was the ability of a Sequence 6 faceless from the Seer pathway, and he demonstrated it to me. Oh my god, I've never seen such a flawless beauty. March 4th. The taste of a faceless is really good. Alice put down her pen. I always feel like Zeratul actively demonstrating his ability seems a bit strange. She gnawed on the knuckle of her right index finger, muttering, and when you put it all together, it sounds like Zeratul and Rosal slept together. Alice fell into deep thought. This didn't seem impossible. It would perfectly explain why Zeratul saw Emperor Rosal in a different light. He was interested in Rosal. Alice reached up and covered her face, deciding to just sell it as is, without bothering further. Anyway, Rosal couldn't possibly crawl out of his grave to say he didn't write it. Alice cheerfully pulled out paper and pen, copied her latest diary entry and the previous ones 10 times each, giving half to Ian and randomly distributing the other half in Byam and several surrounding islands. She had gotten smarter. She couldn't just keep hitting one spot, or it wouldn't spread. When I have nothing to do in the future, I'll go explore other places. After distributing the flyers, Alice made a cheerful decision. The most difficult part, conceiving the diary, was done. Next was the problem of gift packaging. Alice's sense of ritual played a small role here. She felt she should find a gift box to put things in. She chose a long, flat gift box. After placing the diary flat inside, she found that the gift box looked a bit too plain when opened. Unfortunately, Lowen temporarily had no raffia for filling gift boxes for sale, and Alice wasn't sure where to find such a thing. After a brief thought, she made a decision. She plucked a handful of flowers from the Fool's Prayer ritual and threw them in. After doing this, Alice closed the lid and tied a pretty bow on the gift box, and the matter was concluded. Klein, who hadn't yet been released from his volunteer work, didn't refuse, or perhaps couldn't refuse. In any case, at midnight on March 4th, he suddenly woke up in bed and saw Alice about to reach out and pull back his blanket. Before he could speak, Alice quickly retreated out the door and closed it for him. Very good, Klein pulled back his blanket, for the first time grateful that he didn't have a habit of sleeping naked. When he was presentable enough to be seen and walked out of the bedroom, Alice was waiting for him in the parlor. Happy birthday, want some cake? Alice pushed the wrapped diary forward, then pointed to the cake and candles she had prepared. After 2 seconds of stunned, Klein realized that Alice wasn't wearing her school uniform. She was in a colorful dress, whose color reminded him of summer honey. Having read the entire book on ladies' aesthetics, Klein realized that this was not a dress that would exist in this world. Its style was too simple, and its colors too vibrant. It would be hard to see, whether in flamboyant Intis or conservative Lowen. But it had to be said, this dress and Alice's aura exuded a strange sense of harmony. It truly matched the impression Alice left on him. Alice noticed Klein's gaze on her dress, extended her hand, and smiled. I materialized it, what do you think? So it was materialized, then no problem. Klein withdrew his gaze and asked a question he was very concerned about. Why did you have to come in the middle of the night? Today, the fool also had a very severe case of morning grumpiness. Because I don't know the exact time you were born, Alice shrugged, either at that time, or at midnight. Don't you celebrate your birthday like that? Klein shook his head twice, decisively and vigorously. After they stared at each other for more than 10 seconds, Alice was the first to give in, pushing the candles forward and saying, "Anyway, you're already up, and you can't go back to sleep, so light the candles and make a wish." "No, I can go back to sleep, but I feel like you'll pull me up again the moment I fall asleep," Klein grumbled inwardly, taking the candles from Alice's hand. He was surprised to find that Alice had prepared a total of 5 candles, 2 of which were thicker. He raised his head in confusion. Alice gestured for him to insert the candles while explaining, "There are no Arabic numeral candles here, and no birthday lotus lanterns, so we'll just have to use the clumsy method. You're 23 this year, so you should have 23 candles. 10 thin candles are equivalent to 1 thick candle." Klein had heard of this, but he had to admit, he had never celebrated his birthday this way. He wasn't the kind of person who would meticulously insert birthday candles, just as he wouldn't have remembered this birthday if Alice hadn't mentioned it. Sure enough, only children care about these things. Klein glanced at Alice, sighed silently, and began inserting the candles under Alice's direction. After doing this, he instinctively wanted to snap his fingers to light the candles, but then he saw Alice pull out a box of matches, 2 sets of knives and forks, and plates. "What exactly are you wearing under the clothes you materialized?" Klein finally couldn't help but ask. "School uniform," Alice replied without blinking, placing the knives, forks, and plates aside, then striking a match to light the candles. "Don't forget to make a wish." She didn't give Klein time to retort, gently closed her eyes, and clapped her hands while swaying her head, humming the birthday song. "Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you." The full lyrics of the birthday song don't actually just loop, "Happy birthday to you." After singing 4 lines of, "Happy birthday to you," the next 4 lines are, "Happy birthday to you." Next is a loop, but the last line in Chinese should be changed to, "May you always be happy." After singing the second English verse, Alice sang to the end of the song. "Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. May you be happy every day. May you always be happy." Quote, comma, quote. This part looped twice, and a complete birthday song was finally sung. According to the normal course of events, Alice should have immediately opened her eyes, excitedly pressing Klein about what wish he had made. Klein might have refused at first, but in the end, he would, exasperated, reveal the answer, after which Alice would mischievously and anxiously tell him, "A birthday wish won't come true if you say it out loud." But before opening her eyes, Alice heard something shatter. She suddenly opened her eyes and pulled out the wealth accessory from her clothes pocket, an item she had almost forgotten. She turned her palm upwards, and the wealth accessory in her hand emitted a light that was not dazzling, even a little enchanting. Alice was very familiar with that light. She watched as those lights intertwined and danced with the lights wrapped around her, finally forming a line of pinyin. Bu Yao Xing Xian. She stared blankly at the line of pinyin. They only appeared for an instant before dissipating and reorganizing into another line of pinyin. Sheng Ri Kue Le. End of chapter. Chapter 318. Chapter 1. Turning Point. Alice slumped weakly against the back of the chair. She realized almost instantly that the 2 lines of pinyin were not from the same person. If the first half was a warning left by her past self, then the second half was clearly nothing more than a malicious joke. This belated, happy birthday, along with the uniqueness she reclaimed on her birthday, together formed a gift. He first gave her the uniqueness, making her a mythical creature in the true sense, while also forcing her into a position where she had no choice but to become a god, and then showed her this warning. At this moment, she seemed no different from those in the past. She was a toy of the key of light, a toy of fate. This ironic scene did not seem to end. Alice closed her eyes, and the signs of the winter potion being digested arrived simultaneously with the feeling of the misfortune mage ritual being completed, adding a deeper layer of irony to the scene. The chosen, winner, and the bestowed, turning point. She clearly lived everything according to a plan. Alice couldn't describe her mood at this moment, but she understood that in the future, she probably would never again view humans with the mindset of looking at toys, otherwise, she would be reminded of this birthday gift. Ultimately, the Key of Light and Eamon were still different. Eamon was not entirely indifferent to her feelings. With Eamon, she was at least a pet, but with the Key of Light, she was a toy in the complete sense. Alice. Klein's worried voice sounded. Alice then remembered the current situation. She forced a smile at Klein, speaking as if to herself and as if to reassure him. I'm fine, don't worry. This made Klein look even more worried. After saying this, Alice gradually calmed down. She suddenly realized that her fluctuating emotions were also part of this game. Besides, it was already like this, could things get any worse? Alice decisively chose to give up. However, the fire pressing on her heart needed to be vented, otherwise it wouldn't be good for her health. Alice, who first ruled out the option of playing a prank on someone, looked around and her gaze fell on the wealth accessory that had already served its purpose. She cupped the wealth accessory in her fist, then raised her hand high, swung it down forcefully, but then stopped abruptly in midair, looked up, and asked thoughtfully. Do you know any artisans? The rapid shift in topic caught Klein off guard. His brain briefly froze for 2 seconds, and he actually started to think if he knew any artisans. Admiral Emlin's commission, do I still have one artisan crafting opportunity left unused? No, wait a minute, what exactly happened just now? Klein suddenly realized something was wrong, pulled his stray thoughts back, and asked with a frown. You still haven't said what happened. Alice gave a disingenuous smile, placed the brooch on the table, then, under Klein's astonished gaze, blew out the candle, divided the cake into 2 halves, and handed one to him. Klein hesitantly took the cake, his eyes gradually becoming confused. Fate sent me a birthday gift, Alice shrugged, this is a belated happy birthday. After a pause, she explained, my birthday happened to be the day I reclaimed the uniqueness. Klein froze. He remembered the joke Alice made when she obtained the uniqueness, then recalled the line, Buyao Sheng Xian, just now, and suddenly felt a chill. That was from your past self? He asked. Alice nodded. But when you saw that warning, you clearly already. Klein looked down at the cake on his plate, then suddenly looked at Alice with some uncertainty. The line, Buyao Sheng Xian, was a warning, undoubtedly from her past self, but what about, Shangri Kuela? Klein had no doubt about how malicious Alice's personality was, sending someone else's prepared backup plan to them when things were already irreversible was absolutely something she would do. Coupled with the line, Shangri Kuela, everything became even more complete. This was a completely Alice-style birthday gift, if it could even be called a gift. But the problem was, this was herself. Who would do that to themselves? Who would leave a backup plan for themselves and then send it to their future self when it was completely useless, telling her it was a birthday gift? Who would do such a thing? No one would, at least Klein thought so. He looked at Alice, frowning, wanting to press for answers, such as what exactly she meant by the birthday gift, but Alice spoke first. So, do you know any artisans? What do you need an artisan for? He decided to solve the immediate problem first. Alice raised the wealth accessory in her hand and said, I want to break this thing and remake it. There are no requirements for its effect, as long as it can be carried long-term, but I require its appearance to be a monocle. I want to wish him to encounter a cheating player in his game, completely disrupting the rhythm of the entire game, and losing everything. Let him treat me as a toy. Even if he were dumber, Klein would have realized that the him in Alice's words was definitely not her past self. The warning undoubtedly came from her past self, but the next sentence definitely came from another person. Moreover, Klein wasn't stupid. He frowned and asked, who is that him you're talking about? After a moment of silence, Alice looked at him with a half-smile and said, the former owner of the key, or rather, the former owner of the castle I inherited. Key, she means the key of light. Former owner, another castle. A bad premonition suddenly rose in Klein's heart. He tentatively asked, like the mental residue of Beander characteristics. No, Alice shook her head, he is the first owner, and the true owner in every sense. The ownership has always been his, we only have the right to use it. What if, one day, he wants to reclaim the right to use it? Klein didn't need to ask, nor did he need to think. Alice's situation implicitly provided the answer. Her personality and that of him seemed to be not much different. He wasn't sure whether he should feel sad and worried for Alice, or sad and worried for his own future. After all, he had also inherited a castle. Although the owner of the castle had not made any moves yet, but, who knew? He looked at Alice, and before he could express his feelings, anger consumed his heart. Alice grabbed the plate and slapped the cream cake from it onto his face. End of this chapter. Chapter 319 Chapter 2 Prayer. Alice. Klein shouted in for Ryu, of course he got no reply. After a difficult struggle, Klein, with his anger towards Alice, rescued his eyes from the cream and saw the empty seat opposite. Alice had long since disappeared. Klein couldn't describe his mood for a while. He looked at the empty seat and remained silent for a long time, then sighed to the seemingly empty air. Like this, I don't know if you're really fine, or if you just don't want me to ask. After the cake fight, Alice ran back to Backland. Alice didn't want to continue talking about that topic. Although the situation seemed to be as bad as it could get, Alice always held the attitude that since she wasn't dead yet, she might as well live for a bit. She felt that there was nothing she could do anyway, so it was better to deal with it when the time came. But Klein. Alice couldn't understand why Klein worried so much about things so far in the future. As if worrying would provide a solution. But it was precisely because of this that Alice felt a sense of dread after hearing about the apocalypse. Klein seemed like the type of person who would take on everything, no matter how tired he was. His sense of responsibility was too strong. No, maybe my sense of responsibility is too weak. Alice silently lowered her head and repented for herself for 1 second. After repenting, she suddenly became confused again. She really didn't know what she should do now. Hey, Key of Light, is this situation where I don't know what to do also set by you? Alice's questioning voice into the air received no reply. She gritted her teeth and lay directly on the bed. A dozen seconds later, her breathing visibly smoothed out, perfectly reflecting her owner's enviable sleep quality. When she reopened her eyes, it was early morning, the sun had just peeked out. After staring at the ceiling for a while, Alice finally remembered that she should go back to the Golden Dream for class. Is there really nothing else I can do? Alice struggled painfully, rolling around in bed several times before finally remembering that she could go look for potion ingredients. Oh right, after all, her ritual was complete. Unpleasant memories surfaced, and Alice instinctively wanted to avoid them, but then she suddenly stopped. She heard an unfamiliar prayer. The essence of the automatic response to rituals and prayers for high-sequence Goddess of Fate pathway was to allocate a portion of computing power specifically for responding to rituals and prayers. A few special cases were separated by Alice and changed to a manual version. For example, because the scope of proselytizing was not very wide, well, almost non-existent, Alice manually responded to everyone's first prayer. Let me see which unlucky person, no, which lucky person is praying to me. Alice's spirituality curiously spread out. She first smelled the scent of violets and lavender. This person was quite professional. Alice saw a figure kneeling on the ground, praying. This person's hair was brownish gold. Because he had his head bowed and eyes closed, Alice couldn't see the color of his eyes, only confirming that his physique and voice belonged to a young male. Alice concentrated on listening to his prayer. Slumbering Goddess of Fate, you are the master of luck and misfortune, you are the inevitability of all coincidences, I pray. Alice fell into contemplation. The 3-part honorific name did not seem to be entirely made up. Alice realized that this thing could indeed point to her to a certain extent, especially the slumbering part, which made her particularly concerned. Alice wanted to know the inspiration behind the person who created this honorific name. I pray that you bestow luck upon me, I pray that you bestow courage upon me, I pray that you allow me to smoothly drink the potion. The prayer continued. After not being a Nighthawks for half a year, Alice finally personally experienced a supernatural event that pointed to an evil god due to randomly reciting an honorific name and casually holding a ritual, as an evil god. What should I do? Respond to the prayer first or ask him where the honorific name came from first? If I respond, how should I respond? Alice, facing this situation for the first time, pondered for a moment and asked in confusion. How do you wish me to bestow courage upon you? By forcing the potion down your throat. The prayer stopped abruptly. A dozen seconds later, the person opened his eyes in panic. Alice saw a pair of terrified brown eyes. Alice saw him scramble to his feet in terror, even shattering the potion in his panic, but he paid no attention to anything else, stumbling out the door. No, why do you all pray if you don't want a response? After seeing the future scene of him rushing into the Church of the Night for help, Alice shook her head and, concealing her form, appeared in his house. The man didn't know that a strange guest had suddenly appeared in his house. He stumbled out of his home, not even remembering to close the door. Alice, with mixed feelings, locked the door for him. He really didn't consider what would happen if someone came to steal things. Well, he probably wasn't in the mood to consider that. In that case, will he be even more scared if I lock the door? Alice hesitated for a moment, then decided to open the door when she left. Between chasing after him and searching the house first, Alice naturally chose the latter. After all, it was quite easy for her to find people. Alice began to search for the study, which was most likely to hold clues. Judging by the size and layout of the house, the owner's financial situation should be considered affluent, otherwise, he wouldn't be able to dabble in mysticism. Alice was even more certain of this after seeing the study's appearance. He was at least among the top tier of the middle class, with a wealthy family, no worries about food or clothing, and even able to buy a stack of mysticism books for his personal hobby. Alice's movements in rummaging through the room were not cautious. She planned to restore everything once the person returned, so there was no need for caution. She skillfully avoided looking closely at the content of each book, instead judging the frequency of each book's use from its cover and dog-eared pages. She pulled out the visibly older books and focused on checking for any loose papers or notes inside. In addition, Alice paid special attention to notebooks and diaries. She had never actually searched someone else's house under time pressure, or even when she had ample time. It was just that novels and games suggested this seemed to be a more effective way to find clues. It turned out that these experiences were useful. Alice successfully pulled out a slip of paper, which not only contained the honorific name she had just heard but also another one. Phantom of Cassandra. Eyes that gaze upon despair. Wanderer who seeks hope. Chapter 320. Mr. Fool reading notes. Alice, knowing she was looking for an honorific name, kept her guard up. She silently recited the words when she picked up the paper, instead of reading them aloud as she usually did. It was a good thing she didn't, because it was written in ancient Hermes. If she had read it aloud, something bad would have probably happened. Alice closed her eyes, trying to use her spirituality to trace the origin of this note. The people who had come into contact with it, from its creation to its sale, swarmed into Alice's mind. Alice skillfully discarded the other content, focusing her attention on the person who had written these two honorific names. Alice saw a hand wearing a black glove holding a pen, writing these two honorific names stroke by stroke on the paper. She wanted to see the owner of the hand, but suddenly heard a sound. Rustle. It was the sound of pages turning. After that, the images vanished as if a light had suddenly gone out, turning into a patch of darkness. Alice opened her eyes, frowning as she stared at the note. She hadn't used conventional divination, but had directly employed authority. Because of this, the matter seemed particularly illogical. Only authority can block power that involves authority. Cassandra. Alice murmured, soothsayer. Connecting it to the sound of turning pages at the end, Alice remembered the book with the ocean blue cover. That book seemed to have come from a soothsayer. She pondered for a moment, then frowned in confusion and bewilderment, asking herself. But how did she know that story? No, it should be, was the story first, or was she first? If the story came first, then who brought the story? I couldn't have told it to her, could I? By the way, that book can only be considered a mystical item, right? A living mystical item. This was not impossible. Judging by the information the book displayed, it most likely possessed a very high degree of self-awareness. The lucky ones who became its masters, like the mysterious person that day, were probably just puppets. But Alice couldn't figure out what the book was doing. She frowned, realizing that this was, in plain terms, a limitation of knowledge. From this perspective, reading more books really seemed useful. But I'm still not going to read them. Alice made her decision with a clear conscience, then looked at the honorific name thoughtfully and said. Actually, I could also recite this honorific name and see if I can contact it or him. This was clearly a joke. Perhaps Alice half a year ago could have done such a thing, because at this moment, her spirituality wasn't signaling that it was dangerous. But the current Alice already understood that sometimes, by the time her spirituality started to warn her, it was already too late. Moreover, in some situations, spirituality wouldn't give a warning, just like how she never knew her fate was being manipulated from beginning to end. Alice shook her head, memorized the content of the two honorific names, restored the scene, and then interfered with the divination results before leaving the scene. After calming down, Klein didn't rush to open the gift. Instead, he unhurriedly finished his cake. Can't waste food. After finishing the cake, Klein looked at Alice's carefully wrapped gift box and hesitated. Although Alice had given him a heads up that it contained Rosal's diary, Klein was still deeply impressed and wary of the gift Alice had given Eamon. "I'll look at it during the day, during breakfast," he muttered to himself, forcefully suppressing his curiosity and compelling himself to sleep. He was afraid he wouldn't be able to resist going to beat Alice up that very night after reading it. A beautiful morning arrived. Klein opened the gift box before breakfast, preparing to examine the contents of the gift first to make himself a little more alert. He was undoubtedly successful. Not long ago, Klein had mentally set a flag. Nothing Rosal did could surprise him anymore, except turning into a woman. Now, that flag had been realized. April 1st, oh damn, I'm cursed. I've turned into a woman, and a curvy one at that. I can't look at my own body. I can't stand this situation. It's truly terrifying. I enjoy being with ladies, but that doesn't mean I want to become a woman. I hope to recover soon. Klein fell into thought as he read this diary entry, but at least Rosal's reaction was quite normal, nothing strange. Wait a minute, what's next? April 2nd, I experienced the joy of being a woman. Question mark. Question mark question mark question mark. What does "experience the joy of being a woman" mean? Klein felt his pure soul had been defiled, but this didn't seem to be the end. He looked at the last sentence and fell into deep confusion. April 4th, the taste of an iron-blooded night is really good. Question mark. Klein glanced at the date at the beginning and began to consider if this could be an April Fool's joke from the great emperor. There was no other way. Although it seemed very real, it was too absurd. However, Alice had placed another diary below. Did she think the other diary would shock me more? Klein looked at the diary in his hand, completely baffled. What could be more outrageous than the great emperor sleeping with a man after turning into a woman? He looked at the other diary in confusion. The faceless version of the diary didn't start with a bang, it merely described meeting a beautiful woman who turned out to be a man after taking off her pants. This was nothing. Klein, who had once impersonated Elaine, accepted this well and continued reading. Zeratul demonstrated the Faceless's ability to Emperor Rosal the next day. It seems a bit strange. But it's still. What the hell does "the taste of a Faceless is really good" mean? Klein angrily tore the diary in half. This anger wasn't directed at Rosal, but at Alice. 2 pages of diary, one starting on April 1st, the other ending on March 4th. Both dates were April Fool's Day according to Alice. Coupled with Alice's handwriting, Klein, who knew Alice very well, suspected that these two, transcribed, diary pages had no original version at all. After all, Alice had once said famous lines like, "The taste of a primordial demoness is really good," and, "Mr. Fool, I want to have a child with you." This isn't deduction, it's the stereotype of a mischievous child at play. While eating breakfast on the Golden Dream, Alice heard Klein's prayer. Mr. Fool, having finished reading the diary, calmly asked her, "Alice, what did the original 2 pages of the diary you transcribed look like? Can you materialize them for me to see?" Alice looked down at her breakfast on the plate and began to seriously consider the feasibility of simulating a handwriting using computational power. "I knew it would be easily discovered. Fortunately, I already sold it in advance. I'm so smart." End of chapter. Chapter 321 Chapter 4 Raven Shadow Snake Collaboration Handbook released. Alice read the message but didn't reply. She quietly ate breakfast, quietly attended classes, quietly ate lunch, quietly. In short, by that evening, Alice could no longer put it off. The matter concluded with Alice, under Klein's forceful insistence, agreeing not to write new diary entries and to stop selling those 2 pages of the diary. Alice, with a pained expression, agreed to these 2 things, and then, while she was at it, made a request to Mr. Fool. That third opportunity for item creation at Bilt's place, if you're not planning to use it temporarily, could you? Klein immediately recalled Alice's idea of breaking the wealth accessory to make a monocle. Although the idea seemed utterly bizarre to him, Klein didn't stop her. In fact, he took the opportunity to make a demand. When you break the wealth accessory, could you also break that marionettist Beander characteristic? It was a simple task, and Alice had already said she would help Klein resolve the matter, so she readily agreed. Together, she and Klein tacitly avoided mentioning the issue of repaying the item creation opportunity. Aren't these two things mutually exclusive? This could be considered their unspoken understanding. Alice seemed not to mind making concessions in value and would even propose some very peculiar demands as compensation, such as asking him, an angel, to try to transform into a complete female later, but Alice refused free help. Of course, this didn't mean Klein intended to take advantage of Alice. In fact, just as Alice said, for her current self, money was actually something of little significance. Not to mention how easy it was for an angel to acquire worldly wealth. Just considering Alice's pathway, this pathway should by no means lack money. Look, she even managed to pick up a uniqueness, which, by approximation, also counts as picking it up. Klein felt that at certain moments, he completely understood Alice's way of thinking. Since fate is already decided, let's just get some sleep first. He sometimes envied Alice's carefree nature. At least, he felt that if he were Alice, he would never be able to eat and sleep so calmly after learning the truth. Continuing life as before, it was also quite good, easing Miss Justice's workload, and just seeing her like that made his mood unconsciously much lighter. Klein smiled faintly and shook his head, then said to Alice, who was looking at him with confusion. Little children should go to bed early, or they won't grow tall. Though it seems you can't grow any taller. After many days, Alice once again had her internet cable cut by Mr. Fool in bewilderment. Alice angrily sat up from her bed, gritting her teeth and clutching her quilt tightly, fuming. What's there to be proud of? Who isn't 2 meters tall by approximation? I'll grow 2 meters tall in my next life. After making this grand vow in anger, Alice fell asleep again. Although she had claimed she would skip class to look for potion ingredients, Alice still dutifully went to class the next morning. After class, she stopped teacher Edwina and proactively asked, Captain, can mystical items have an honorific name? Edwina recalled for a moment and replied, I haven't encountered a similar situation. So that means it's not possible. Alice frowned slightly. Edwina glanced at her and corrected. For high sequence, mystical items with complete vitality, it might not be impossible. But so far, the closest case I've encountered to this situation is. Edwina's gaze fell on Alice. Alice stood blankly for a few seconds before realizing that she was the closest case. Don't even mention it, seriously. Alice shook her head and continued to ask, then do you know what Doomshade and Raven Shadow Serpent are? After a moment of hesitation, Alice ultimately didn't ask Edwina if she had seen a misfortune mage or the corresponding mystical item. Even mentioning a demigod wouldn't be appropriate, as I couldn't explain why I was looking for it. But asking about monster information from a potion formula I regrettably missed is quite reasonable. Of course, if Edwina isn't aware of the misfortune mage's potion formula, that would be even better. Edwina wasn't aware of what Alice was thinking. After a brief recollection, she gave Alice a surprise. I have seen a raven shadow serpent. Alice's eyes lit up, and she blurted out, where? As soon as the words left her mouth, Alice realized something was wrong. She had shown too much excitement. If she were merely searching out of curiosity, she shouldn't be so thrilled. Meeting Edwina's eyes, which were mostly unreadable, Alice gritted her teeth and chose to play dead. At worst, she'd guess that she had swallowed a uniqueness. It wasn't just out of curiosity, but a genuine need. 2 monsters, both close to demigod level, and their abilities were also linked to fate. Could they be Beander ingredients? For sequence 4. At this thought, Edwina couldn't help but glance at Alice. Why would she still need sequence 4 Beander ingredients? After catching Alice's attitude, which was like a zombie unafraid of boiling water, Edwina gave up on further inquiry and instead introduced. The Raven Shadow Serpent can release an aura that envelops its prey or enemies. Creatures enveloped by this aura become sluggish in movement, confused in thought, and their luck becomes extremely poor. In addition, the Raven Shadow Serpent can predict an enemy's actions and attack or evade accordingly. They like to hide in secluded and historically significant places. Sometimes we find these creatures in treasures. The Raven Shadow Serpent's body is covered in scales, but its defense isn't actually strong. Although it has sharp teeth, that's only relative to ordinary people, and its strength isn't particularly outstanding either. Their main method of attack is actually to hide in the dark and launch attacks using their surroundings. And it's speculated that the Raven Shadow Serpent should be able to detect fatal threats to itself and escape in advance. Alice frowned more and more as she listened, growing more and more silent, until finally, she couldn't help but ask. Did they have no dignity at all? They just run away like that. Don't they even try to see if they can win? Edwina looked at Alice with a slightly bewildered expression. Alice lowered her head guiltily, she seemed to be pretty much the same. You want to catch them alive? Edwina asked tentatively. Dead is fine too, Alice gave up directly, saying whatever came to mind. I need blood and a heart. If that's really not possible, do you have any misfortune mages you don't like? End of chapter. Chapter 322 Chapter 5 The Faith of the Reader. Case closed. She really does need a Beander characteristic. Alice's candid attitude gave Edwina the answer directly. She ignored Alice's last question and offered her own suggestion. Perhaps you could try to interfere with their judgment of danger. This seems feasible. After all, if their judgment comes from the aspect of destiny, then my standing is clearly higher. It sounds like the real difficulty isn't defeating them, but finding them. Once found, even Klein should be able to defeat them. Bah, what am I thinking? Alice removed the respected Mr. Fool from her unit of measurement, then, with the thought as since I'm already freeloading, I might as well freeload all the way, she asked. What about the Doom Shade? Edwina, however, did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced at Alice and said thoughtfully. The Beyonders of the Destiny pathway I recall seem to value equivalent exchange greatly, but you haven't mentioned anything about compensation yet. Alice paused her movements. She thought for a moment, then tentatively asked, a prophecy, or a portion of luck? Edwina shook her head and told her, within the church, we usually exchange knowledge for knowledge. Exchange knowledge for knowledge. She doesn't have much knowledge to exchange. Oh no, she wants to ask about the civilization before the first epoch. Understanding the answer, Alice frowned, looking at Edwina's bright eyes, and said with a furrowed brow. The last time I brought up what you wanted to know, the hidden sage came to take a look. A trace of obvious surprise flashed in Edwina's eyes. Alice was referring to the internet, but considering the Church of Knowledge's pay attention to of knowledge, she said thoughtfully. However, this really seems quite suitable for you all. Although they also advocate knowledge, readers are not like mystery priors after all. Their top god of knowledge and wisdom is not a lunatic like the hidden sage, who would spam junk ads everywhere once the internet is set up. If readers could connect with each other, it would only be an excellent information exchange platform. Alice glanced at the bright-eyed Edwina and said seriously, why don't you just pray to me? For worshippers who have prayed, she can directly instill knowledge. Edwina showed no sign of refusal, her transition into the role was remarkably swift. What is your honorific name and the ritual required for prayer? Alice developed an unprecedented suspicion about the Church of Knowledge's loyalty, falling into a state of sympathy for the God of knowledge and wisdom. Hey, the leader is a traitor, and the subordinates are also secretly being traitors. No, it's possible they're openly being traitors. If the beam above is crooked, the beam below will be crooked too. Alice muttered inwardly while saying with a complex expression. Your Church of Knowledge's faith is so casual. It feels just like how I used to pray to everyone when I encountered problems in the past. In fact, this was not only the norm in the world Alice remembered, but even in Loan, it was the norm for most shallow believers. They would attend important ceremonies, worship whoever could help them when needed, and switch faiths without hesitation when their parish changed. Unlike devout believers, for most shallow believers, faith was merely a means to live better. It feels like all the God of Wisdom's devout believers are shallow believers, and perhaps the more devout, the faster they betray. After all, if the God is like this, the believers probably aren't much different. Can this be said? Recalling Mr. Hanged Man's daily frights, Alice decided it was better not to say it. This seems a bit unfair to Mr. Hanged Man. Next time, I'll apologize to Mr. Hanged Man. Forget it, he'd probably be even more scared if I apologized, right? Alice, with a clear understanding of herself, gave up the idea of apologizing and decided to be more careful with her words and actions in the future. Try to be careful. Edwina didn't know what Alice was thinking, but after hearing Alice's words, she still decided to salvage some image for her church. We believe in knowledge, or rather, readers only believe in knowledge. This statement had a strange yet familiar flavor. Alice immediately thought of Charlie, the winner, Beander characteristics owner, who believed that everything was a gift of destiny. Apparently, this gentleman seemed to believe in destiny. She subconsciously wanted to say, "You shouldn't believe in that, friend," but she swallowed the words and instead asked, "Then would you commit suicide to gain knowledge?" "Of course not," Edwina immediately denied. "Only by living can one gain more knowledge." "Good, so it seems to be mainly a problem of destiny, is it?" "It's definitely not my problem, right, Key of Light." Alice shook her head, stroked her chin, and said, "If I don't have suitable knowledge for now, you won't tell me what a doom shade is, will you?" Edwina shook her head and said, "Consider it a reservation then. This is a special creature. They travel through the spirit world, entering places in the real world filled with tragedy and suffering, and attach themselves to an area. Everyone who steps into that area will be afflicted with misfortune, and the longer they stay, the more severe this phenomenon becomes. At the same time, the doom shade emits a special influence. If one stays near a doom shade long enough, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain sanity." About 10 seconds after Edwina stopped speaking, Alice hesitantly asked, "That's it?" Edwina looked at her in confusion, as if she didn't understand what else Alice wanted to hear. Alice thought for a moment and asked, "What does it mean to be attached to an area?" Edwina explained, "Someone once discovered that within the area where a doom shade is attached, it seems to exist simultaneously at various locations within that area." Alice's mouth dropped open in surprise, and she asked in confusion, "Then, how can I attack it?" "That's your problem," Edwina shook her head and said. "We usually just drive it away, sometimes not even that. If you have a good method, you're welcome to tell us." Alice closed her mouth. She didn't ask how to drive them away. After all, given that readers can mimic abilities they understand, there's too much they can do. Aside from anything else, Alice remembered that Admiral Emlyn's talisman could do something similar. In any case, she at least finally knew what the main Beander characteristic for her potion was. So, what's the next step? How to promote the internet to the God of Wisdom. End of this chapter. Chapter 323, Chapter 6, Light that Dispels the Fog. Alice couldn't come up with a satisfactory solution throughout the weekend and on Monday morning. As the new week's Tarot Club meeting was approaching, Alice cheerfully decided to pass the buck to Klein. At the Tarot Club, Miss Fate secretly arranged work for Mr. Fool while Miss Justice stood up to greet him. The trading session was finally no longer Alice's solo act. No, today Alice didn't intend to participate in the trading session, it was now the world's solo act. "Mr. Fool, I request to speak with Miss Hermit in private." Klein, in the gray fog, feigned a slight nod and then blocked the sight of others. Suddenly facing the familiar gray fog, Alice idly kicked the chair legs twice, then suddenly remembered the rays of light entanglement around her. Could this fog be illuminated? After blocking the sight and hearing of others, Klein, controlling the world, spoke. "Star Admiral, I have a commission." Just that one sentence made Catlia's expression change. Connecting it to the previous conversation between the world and Alice, she blurted out. "Miss Fate told you." Klein, who was in the middle of fabricating an excuse, paused. Just as he was about to have the world admit it smoothly, a faint light suddenly bloomed, gently but firmly pushing aside the mist, revealing Alice behind it. Klein couldn't bother controlling the world anymore. He timely restrained his main body from making large movements, but still turned his gaze towards Alice. He wanted Alice to understand what he wanted to ask. Alice indeed didn't disappoint him. Her bewildered gaze swept over the world and Hermit Catlia before she realized the current situation. She immediately turned to the head of the bronze long table and said with a hesitant tone, If I said I didn't do it on purpose, would you believe me? I was just trying it out, you know. I didn't know it would be like this. How come I feel like her authority here is about to surpass mine?" Klein looked at Alice with a complicated feeling. No matter how much turmoil he felt inside, his tone remained calm. "Listen together. Okay." Alice, already feeling guilty, responded briefly and then sat down obediently, listening quietly. Glancing at the still bewildered Katlia, Klein, controlling the world, answered her previous question. No, she is actually very trustworthy when it comes to important matters. She definitely won't let you get into an accident, it's just that it might be quite entertaining. Remembering Admiral Emlin's fallen pants, Klein fell silent for a moment. Katlia glanced at Alice and the world, and began to carefully analyze the world's words. Trustworthy in important matters, then, what about normally? She didn't ask out loud, but calmly inquired, what commission? I hope to go to sea to find mermaids. The world stated his purpose without hesitation. Alice's eyes lit up, and her body eagerly leaned forward a few inches, almost lifting off the stool, but she ultimately stopped herself, sat back down on the chair, and watched them with sparkling eyes. One of the manifestations of respect is not to interrupt casually. If I can't achieve inner respect for a while, I'll just show formal respect first. Alice looked pitiful and dejected. Klein forced himself not to look at her and focused on discussing the sea voyage with Katlia. Instead, Katlia couldn't help but look at Alice midway. After all, her gaze was too fervent. Praise clown. Klein sighed inwardly. After everything was settled, he, controlling the world, asked Katlia. Can I bring a Sequence 0 sealed artifact on board? Sequence 0 sealed artifact. Katlia was stunned for 2 seconds, then suddenly remembered Alice's earlier jest about being a mystical item, and looked over with a surprised expression. Alice Kingsley, the Sequence 0 sealed artifact, after a moment of stunned silence, quickly reacted and focused her fervent gaze on Katlia. Agree to him, Miss Hermit. Katlia inexplicably felt as if she heard such a voice. She swallowed, pushing that absurd thought back, and asked cautiously, can you guarantee that this Sequence 0 sealed artifact won't suddenly lose control on the way? Can you guarantee that it will always listen to you? That depends on whether our journey is interesting enough, the world responded. However, I can guarantee that no one will die unexpectedly because of it. But there might be some emotional damage. Whether the journey is interesting enough. Katlia uncontrollably recalled Frank Lee. This type of interesting. Katlia shook her head, about to say something, but then suddenly realized something she had overlooked. When did Miss Fate learn to request? And not even a request she herself voiced. No, if Miss Fate voiced it, no one would consider it a request, so it really was requesting. It even considered her feelings. Katlia suddenly looked at Alice, paused briefly in Alice's puzzled gaze, then turned back and said, I think, before I agree to you, I need to find a way to seal my eyes first. Alice cautiously raised her hand and said, actually, if you look at me now, there shouldn't be a problem. After all, you aren't even a demigod. After retrieving the uniqueness, she already had the ability to conceal her unique characteristics. Although most of the time she was too lazy to do so. Anyway, for now, those with low enough and high enough sequences probably wouldn't have any issues looking, and those with high but not high enough sequences would just have to consider themselves unlucky. This mindset doesn't seem quite right either. I'll change it, I'll hide it normally from now on. Alice cautiously corrected another one of her erroneous mindsets. Wasn't my wording a bit inappropriate just now? Forget it, I don't care, I've made great progress to this extent, I should reward myself. Alice cheered herself on in her heart. Katlia didn't know how many mental activities Alice had in such a short time. She was only surprised for a moment, then realized that this might be a manifestation of deepening control over authority. She became even more cautious and bowed her head, saying, in that case, I have no other questions. How about giving Frank a vacation for this sea trip? No, never mind, he's more dangerous on land. Sigh. Katlia restrained her desire to look up and tentatively asked Alice. Miss Fate, are you still interested in the fish with many flavors you mentioned earlier? End of chapter. Chapter 324. Chapter 7. The stereotype of the prophet. The long-forgotten topic was brought up again. Alice froze for 2 seconds, recalling the Beander who enjoyed researching hybrid breeding techniques. That Beander you mentioned earlier, is he on your ship? Alice's expression was hesitant. Klein swallowed in the gray fog. Katlia nodded heavily. What a strange person he sounds like, but I'm so curious, I really want to see him. Alice didn't speak. She just looked at Katlia with sparkling eyes. Katlia realized she now had no possibility of refusing. She couldn't help but look at the world. The world, as if not receiving her hint, replied. Then it's settled, Lady Hermit. She's just a bit playful, she shouldn't do anything too strange, right? Throughout the entire Tarot Club meeting that followed, Mr. Fool spent it in a state of extreme worry. He had several thoughts of backing out, but dismissed them as soon as they arose. Alice might just think it's fun now. If he backed out, she would be seriously causing trouble. This matter was settled. After the Tarot Club ended, Alice asked Klein a question. Do you know how to bypass the hidden sage if I want to discuss some extremely secret, extremely rare knowledge outside? Klein glanced at Alice, then pondered for a moment before asking. Why do you think I would know this? Alice blinked twice, then let out a soft, "Ah," before saying, it seems so. No, I actually just habitually ask you when I have something. Why do I feel? Klein recalled Alice's description of Medici, and his expression gradually became strange, that I'm like your long-lost, unrelated mother right now. Well, it does seem a bit like that. Alice lowered her head, thought for a few seconds, then looked up and seriously retorted. Don't say that. Maybe we'll have a chance to be related by blood in the future. Klein looked at Alice with an extremely horrified expression and shrieked excitedly, even with a restart, men can't have children. Alice reminded him faintly, the taste of a faceless is truly. Alice. Klein angrily interrupted her. Alice obediently rephrased the latter half of her sentence. When you reach the later sequences, let alone a man, it's not even certain if you'll be human. I think it's quite normal to be able to have children. Yes, actually, according to her, the gender of high sequence beyonders on the fate pathway seems to depend only on self-perception. Other pathways are probably similar, with only special cases like Demoness and Iron-Blooded Knight being exceptions. Will I really be able to have children later? Wait, with whom? Klein recalled Aemon, who became pregnant and bore him 108 children in that story, and the Mother Tree of Desire, who wanted to have children with him. He looked at Alice and fell into deep thought. What are you thinking? Alice asked, puzzled. I'm thinking, if you call me Mom, who should you call Dad? Klein answered in his heart, but knowing Alice's nature, he understood that once he said it out loud, Alice would definitely seriously consider the question. He didn't dare to imagine what conclusion Alice would come to. To steer the conversation away from dangerous territory, Klein offered Alice a suggestion. You could try asking Bernadette. She is the leader of Oravi Island and has been leading Oravi Island against the Moses Ascetic Order. She herself is a mystery prior demigod, so she should be very experienced in this area. Oravi Island. Alice recalled the organization after a brief thought. It was a new organization that emerged in the last 100 or 200 years, incorporating elements from various schools of mysticism. It had its own set of theories, and its members were skilled in spellcasting, mastering many ancient sorceries. That truly is a big shot in the Beyonder world. After all, our Tarot Club currently has fewer than 10 official members, and we even have to rely on Mr. Fool's avatar to hold the fort. Alice felt a bit self-conscious. She clenched her fists and encouraged Klein. Mr. Fool, you must work hard to recover your state and reclaim your authority, and at the same time, make our Tarot Club flourish. Klein was utterly bewildered. I look forward to the day when all 78 tarot cards find their owners. On March 7, 1350 of the 5th epoch, in Mr. Fool's divine kingdom, Miss Fate solemnly patted Mr. Fool's shoulder, outlining a blueprint for his future. Regarding this matter, Mr. Fool's attitude was this. Alice, it's one thing to fool others, but how can you believe it yourself? I'm not a true evil god. Alice shook her head and said with a feigned profoundness. Mr. Fool, I understand. For you, past glories have faded like shooting stars across the night sky, buried by the sands of time, obscured by the mists of history. For you now, seizing every opportunity, creating new miracles, and spreading new epics across this land is what you should do most. You are not one to dwell on the past, those will only become beliefs that motivate you forward. Klein's mouth gradually widened. He stared blankly until Alice finished speaking, then reached up and pushed his jaw back into place. What's gotten into her now? Forget it, at least I don't have to worry about her spilling the beans. I feel like she's almost convinced herself of her own words. Klein looked at Alice with a complicated expression and cautiously asked, Have you encountered anything strange or anyone strange these past few days? Alice was silent for more than 10 seconds, then slumped ungracefully in her chair, answering with a face full of resentment. I met if there are no accidents, it should be a soothsayer. She called me, child, over and over, and her mouth was full of, tracks of fate, veil of fate, gears of fate. I'm wondering if all soothsayers are like this. If so, I'll adapt in advance. Oh right, soothsayer is the name of my sequence 2 potion. Klein fell into deep thought. He really wanted to correct Alice's actions, as he didn't want to become a test subject, but after a moment's thought, he realized, the soothsayers in his impression really seemed to be like that. Mysterious attire and tone, ambiguous words composed of numerous metaphors and allusions, coupled with a confident attitude, together formed the image of soothsayers in various stories and legends. Of course, all of this was predicated on the most core element, successfully realized prophecies. Moreover, these prophecies often came true in ways people least expected. End of chapter. Chapter 325. Chapter 8. Encounter again and again. Even though Klein understood that the true acting method of a soothsayer wouldn't be so superficial, he still couldn't help but feel terrified. Alice wouldn't keep talking like this from now on, would she? Klein seriously imagined Alice speaking while wearing a black robe, and a vivid image immediately appeared in his mind. Everything felt perfectly natural. Of course, in the image Klein imagined, when Alice walked, lifting the hem of her robe, underneath was the floral dress from his birthday. She might occasionally pretend, but it was impossible for her to genuinely become like that. They began to look at each other with worried eyes, and after a long while, Alice murmured, if only there were a living soothsayer, no, a living snake of fate for me to ask. A living snake of fate. Klein was stunned, and instantly remembered someone. Will Osepton. First, do you think he would tell me? Alice rolled her eyes. Second, if you're talking about memories, then unfortunately, my memories aren't even continuous. The intermittent periods of lethargy and waking, combined with the immense time span in between, had caused severe gaps in Alice's memory. She simply couldn't piece together much useful information from it. Being able to deduce the beginning and end of events, as well as their final relationship progression, was already the result of her best efforts. The acting method, unless Will Osepton was explaining the acting method to her in the fragments she remembered, it would be impossible, wouldn't it? Alice pinched her brow, glanced at Klein, and said expressionlessly, Mr. Fool, if the acting requirements of a soothsayer are really like this, then you're finished. After dropping this bombshell, Alice returned to the real world without waiting for Klein's reply. Despite being eager to pay off the debt, Alice did not write to Bernadette. The Alice who had no memories and was utterly confused could casually ask strangers for help, but Miss Fate of the Tarot Club was already a deity who had recovered some of her authority. She should not and could not ask Bernadette, who was merely a demigod, for help. If it really didn't work, she could try if the hidden effect could defend against the hidden sage. In that case, why don't I just go directly to the goddess? A new alternative plan was successfully added to Alice's list. Temporarily setting aside 2 relatively important matters, Alice began to consider what she should do next. Coming to the Golden Dream was originally a decision made because she didn't know what to do and didn't know what the main ingredient of the potion was. Now that she knew the information about the main ingredient, the next step should be to collect the materials. First, inquire about the location. Why didn't she ask about it during the Tarot Club earlier? Alice fell into deep thought. Never mind, it's not a big problem. It's only a week, at most, it'll pass after a sleep. Alice shook her head, frowning as she continued to ponder. Gather information, then go there, then hunt it myself or find someone to hunt it. I understand, I need to make money. Alice discovered the true meaning of life. Her footsteps stopped, and she looked at the casino by the roadside. The outrageous statement of, winning a casino, from not long ago echoed in her mind again. Could she really not do that? Dangerous thoughts stirred in Alice's mind, pinning her feet to the spot. As she stared at the casino's signboard, drooling, an acquaintance walked out from inside. Her one-sided acquaintance. Familiar black hair and blue eyes, but he was no longer wearing formal attire. His new jacket, of unknown origin, was in the local style of Byam and looked a bit old. His expression was neither the initial apprehension nor the second time's excitement, but rather one of annoyance. Alice saw him spit at the casino as he came out. He had probably lost money. So, who is he? What makes them meet again and again? Alice frowned as she looked at this stranger she had encountered 3 times, her eyes glinting slightly as she quietly approached him. She remained in a hidden state, so no one noticed her, including her target. An unknown scent, a mix of smoke, alcohol, and sweat, wafted into Alice's nostrils with the wind. Evidently, the smell came from this man. He had probably spent a considerable amount of time in the casino, to the point where the scent had clung to him. Alice pondered for a moment, then conjured a long black warlock's robe on herself, covering herself completely from head to toe. She also conjured a black veil over her face, leaving only a pair of clear blue eyes visible. Afterward, Alice lowered her head and looked at the overly plain black robe, recalling the faint silver runes she had seen in that book that day, and added some special effects to the ordinary warlock's robe. She quietly followed the man until he turned into a slightly secluded alley. Only then did Alice appear at the end of the alley, leaning against the wall. She watched the man, his transformation from winning money to losing money over this period flashing through her mind. Alice didn't deliberately change her voice, and in her still somewhat childish tone, she slowly said, "Poor child, shadows have shrouded your fate, and you must have lost many things recently. Cassandra, you're back." He raised his bowed head, his voice filled with surprise as he exclaimed, "Cassandra." Alice frowned slightly. She instantly realized the reason for their repeated encounters. This man knew someone who called herself Cassandra. Was this story God's legend too widespread, or were all the Cassandras I've met actually the same person? Or perhaps, in certain special groups, this name holds a special meaning, recalling Cassandra the soothsayer, cursed in the story to be disbelieved and ultimately dying by her own prophecies, and then thinking of the potential issues with high-sequence individuals on the fate pathway. Alice's frown deepened. Fortunately, the shadow of her hood concealed her exposed brows and eyes. Her tightly furrowed brow was hidden, and coupled with her half-turned body, the man did not notice her emotional reaction to his words. If someone used Cassandra to refer to something, an honorific name instantly came to Alice's mind. Phantom of Cassandra. Eyes that gaze upon despair. Walker who seeks hope. Why, eyes that gaze upon despair, and why, walker who seeks hope? What did the owner of that honorific name see in the river of fate to write such an honorific name for herself? End of chapter. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.